All right, so we have a returning guest today, and I typically like to have people introduce themselves, but this is a conversation that kind of came, I won't say out of nowhere, but is an example that I'm hoping we get into the spirit of academia and like what it means to engage in philosophy. So, would you introduce yourself again?
Sure. Well, my name is Chris Robertson. I write under CV because it's more interesting than Chris. Everyone and their mother in my generation was named Chris, so it's just a little more. And I found out some years after I began writing under CB that my great grandfather wrote under CD Robertson. So that was kind of cool.
Awesome.
Um, but anyways, I write. I'm an electrician, former truck driver, and I write books and essays and stuff about philosophy because I enjoy it.
What a terrible pastime you have. I think, so we've had some conversations for some time, and I think you represent a really good example of how people will pursue intellectual achievement for things other than the money, the business, the brand, the whatever, right? And so,
Right.
and the conversation that I think that we've been talking about having is funny because we're talking about a conversation, but we're going to be talking about objectivity, morals, a little bit of probably on moral relativism and how do we understand these things and so on and so forth. But the goal that I want to achieve, I've been wanting to achieve for this show and for conversations like this, is to have and host the kinds of conversations that are not being had in academia about large moral questions and what's going on in the world and decisions that we make, and really go back to the spirit of what the academics was supposed to be about, which
Sure.
is pursuit of truth. And so that's how we end up getting here. But I don't even know how to begin. Let's just dive right in.
Well,
So
well, the pursuit of truth is an interesting way of phrasing it, given how this conversation began. But
exactly,
we can.
exactly. So I want to let's do this not necessarily in a debate format, but
Mm,
I've read a couple of your articles on the subject. You also made some social media posts about it recently. And what is your thesis that you're saying, so I can make sure I understand it in the best way possible?
sure. I'm realizing this is going to serve as a kind of advertisement for a fairly lengthy essay coming out.
Okay.
Um, oh, will probably already be out by the time that it comes out. But basically, I'm not saying anything particularly original in the context of philosophy. It comes from some fairly obscure sources, I suppose. Um, but you can get the message essentially from Ludwig Wittgenstein
Okay.
and also from Hamann, a less well-known German counter-enlightenment philosopher.
Okay.
People who enjoy pleasant voices on YouTube should check out the lectures of Isaiah Berlin, something of a counter-enlightenment philosopher in his own right, although more contemporary. And he gives these beautiful, wonderful, and fun introductory lectures about the philosophies of, among other people, Joseph de Maistre, who might be one of the most underrated philosophers of all time,
Okay.
a Catholic anti-Enlightenment philosopher of the 18th century,
Okay.
living contemporaneously with Rousseau, absolutely eviscerated the French Revolution and its notions at the time that it was happening.
Very interesting. Yeah, the French Revolution is a subject of that I've continuously had great interest, sometimes in
Yeah,
nightmare format.
but it
Can
was
you summarize what you mean when you say counter enlightenment?
yes. So let me finish my point about Wittgenstein and Hamann first, and then that will, I think, segue into the Enlightenment.
Okay.
Because Hamann's criticism of the Enlightenment, um, like Wittgenstein, although Wittgenstein wasn't necessarily into that, but they were both interested in language,
Mm-hmm.
and they were both thought about the nature of language and the relationship between language and thought.
Okay.
And Wittgenstein is, I love Wittgenstein so much because he's a very interesting example of a philosopher who came out with a profound idea early on in his career. It was tremendously popular. Very like the Tractatus was a very well known and well received book in its time. Only for him to turn around 20 years later and say, I think I was wrong. I think that book went the wrong way, and I think language is actually not what I thought it was when I was younger.
Okay.
And then he wrote his logical or philosophical investigations, which was published posthumously, that said actually language is a little bit more complicated than that, and language is more like a series of games, and there are many language games you can play, and things are not strict nonsense if they don't conform to this one game of language we call logic or reason or so forth. And so Wittgenstein was touching on was that language is much more amorphous and mercurial in nature than philosophers in particular are often inclined to believe it to be.
Okay.
But Hamann, I think, gets closer to the subject of Kant, who we can get into perhaps in a little bit. I'm sorry for bringing up so much at once. But
this is exactly what we have to do. I'm having this conversation because I'm entertained by it in a sense.
It is very entertaining if you're a certain kind of person. But Hamann was of the opinion that all thought occurs by means of language. It's I'll tell a joke that I told Jack recently, but it comes from the gentleman I was mentioning before, Vox Day. His wife was in school with a friend, and the friend said, I've got deep thoughts. I just have a hard time putting them into words. And the Vox Day's wife said, those aren't ideas. Those aren't thoughts. Those are just feelings. And if you can't put them into words, they're not thoughts. It's a fairly brutal thing for a woman to tell another woman.
It's a pretty savage way of saying I have deep thoughts. I just don't know the words for them. Okay, I mean, and it's funny, but how would you distinguish? You don't have thoughts. You have feelings. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I don't think I was given was like a really sharp wit when it comes to like street talk. You know what I mean? Like I was telling a story recently. I was talking to a guy about something that happened once, and it's just like I've never really had that. Now, some of that is I grew up in the Midwest, and the Midwest is notorious for not doing these kind of things and whatever. But it is what it is, right? We have our own versions of wit and quip.
Right.
So we're getting into this direction on. So the person's was making a claim that thought requires language. Wait. Is that,
yes.
Okay.
Hamann is saying you can't actually think without the use of language.
Okay.
And when you think about this, and I'm not as familiar with Hamann as I am with de Maistre. Mm-hmm. All I know of Hamann, because virtually none of him is translated into English. Okay. It's only secondhand through Isaiah Berlin, whose lectures I highly recommend. They're very entertaining. He's just a pleasant voice to listen to, and also his thoughts are very interesting, and they draw from very interesting places. But what follows, if you assume that language is this mercurial thing that is arbitrary by definition, the way language works is we assign sounds to objects that they refer to, and what the sound we choose isn't necessarily that important. I mean, the proof of this is that different languages don't even share the same onomatopoeia sounds. Mm-hmm. Like a dog says "wan wan" in Japanese, but "bark bark" or "bow wow" here, which also don't have anything to do with each other.
Yeah. Or like in Americans, when we're playing with finger guns, we go bang bang bang, and in Afghanistan they go dum dum dum.
Yeah, but it's changing now. It's no longer bang bang. It's now pew pew.
Sure. Yeah, pew pew bang bang dum
dum. Which dum dum might actually be the phonetically closest, but none of them are, of course, objective. And it doesn't matter, is the point. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the use of language within the many different language games we can play. And an example of a language game is, for example, I am trying to convey to you my impression of Isaiah Berlin's impression of Hamann's thought. Yep. So I'm trying to play a telephone game of accurately conveying information to you. Mm-hmm. I could in an alternative timeline be making stuff up to pass the time in an act that is, in philosophical jargon, known as earmuffs for kids, bullshitting. Now, bullshitting is not quite the same thing as lying. Lying is like, I'm trying to deceive you and I know the truth and I'm trying to convince you of something that isn't the truth. Bullshitting is more like, I'm just going to make up big fish stories to entertain myself and you and to kind of pass the time and just have fun, essentially.
Yeah, doing like what we accuse someone of being a philosophaster, in the sense where like you're not really, you're like, you're wasting time because you're not engaging in true academics. Yeah.
Now, is that illegitimate? Is it illegitimate to bullshit? Within the context of the language game of conveying accurate historical information about a particular person to you, yes, that would be illegitimate. If you met me at a bus stop and our bus was running 20 minutes late and I'm just like, you ever hear about those two guys that walked into a bar, and, tell some story? Now, you can do the Robin Williams from Good Will Hunting line. It's like, that never happened on the airplane, did it? Because the Good Will Hunting character said, gave this story about the pilots that left the mic on, and they said, man, I could use a coffee and a blowjob right now. And the waitress comes running down to say, oh, your mic's still on. And the person says, hey, don't forget the coffee. And Robin Williams says, you've never been on a plane, have you, Will? And Will says,
I haven't seen the movie, to be honest.
Oh my gosh, you've got to.
So you're not spoiling it for me.
Okay.
It's one of those that's on the list of movies that I know I need to watch. But
it's an excellent movie, especially for having been written by a couple of teenagers.
Let's still not get distracted, though. You're making. But yes, are you making a moral claim about bullshitting? I mean, let's be.
Yes. Okay. Well, sort of. I'm contextualizing the language game of bullshitting.
Okay.
And say, when Will Hunting tells this story, and his therapist says, have you ever been on a plane, Will? And Will says, well, no, but the joke sounds better when I tell it in the first person. Has he committed some kind of moral wrong by acting as if the story actually happened when it didn't?
So he's talking to somebody under the guise of, or he's talking to somebody under the impression that they're intending to be honest, but he's not being honest.
Well, he's telling a joke.
Okay, he's telling a joke. Yeah, but he's also well. I mean, no. I'm not really sure I would allow it to be written off. It's certainly not as malicious as say overtly lying to somebody, right? Do not believe your lying eyes or whatever. That is different than what we're talking about here. But at the same time, there's still I'm not saying all deception is wrong, but I think that there's still something to be had there, because we do this all the time. I'll use the example of we don't do this. I'm not saying we do this all the time, but I'll use the example of stolen valor. Oftentimes, people who lie about what they've done in life are simultaneously dealing with a lack of self-esteem. They do not believe that they've achieved, or some almost like borderline sociopathy, psychopathy kind of issue. So, and people who end up committing what we call stolen valor typically come in one of two categories. Either they are actually mentally, they're mental in the sense that whatever the trendy word is today, where they're like, they're actually insane. They believe their own lies, or they allowed an embellishment to keep getting away from them and keep getting away, and they didn't squash an embellishment before it became their identity, and then they started living it.
Right.
And so
they believed their own BS, as the saying goes.
But in the example of like bullshitting, I think there's something. I think the intent of the individual carries moral weight to it. But we're starting to split hairs a little bit.
Well, and beyond the intention, the broader context. So if someone gets up and tells, for example, do you listen to stand-up comedy at all, by chance?
Occasionally. I'm not a big
have
ones.
you heard the story of The Machine?
Yeah. The
Yeah.
dude in Russia, no shirt,
Yeah. So
bear,
if
like
you found out that story, which was told in a stand-up comedy context,
yep,
if you found out that that story was completely fiction, was completely made up, never
sure,
happened,
sure,
it would be a little disappointing, I
yes,
think. But would it be the same as if instead of saying it shirtless on a stand-up comedy platform, where it is kind of expected that some of the stories are maybe embellished slightly,
mm-hmm.
if he had been wearing a suit and tie and said that story after putting his hand on the Bible saying, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before some Senate hearing committee.
I think as far as like the complexity of I'm sorry, as far as the morality between the two things, because I want to make sure we separate whether a thing is moral or whether or not I would be emotionally affected by it. And so ultimately the answer would be they are different because one is intending to entertain and one is intending to convince you its legitimacy.
Right. And the
Yes.
contexts dictate what would be appropriate intentions in each of these cases. Because someone could get up on a comedy stage with any number of intentions that might be legitimate or illegitimate.
Okay.
And someone could similarly get up and testify in some legal context, similarly with maybe multiple different possible intentions. Again, some of them legitimate, some of them illegitimate.
Yeah, I mean, there are supposed to be consequences for lying in Congress or something like that, right? Like
Right,
if
supposed to be.
well, I mean, we're seeing like what's going on in politics.tm right now is like Fannie Willis of Georgia is getting dragged through some sort of hearing because she is like it doesn't matter. It would get into too much politics, but like essentially her entire accusation campaign against Trump is not only artificial, but probably not only immoral, artificial, but also illegal. In the sense that, like, she funded a dude to do it. She paid. It's all corrupt and it's gonna. But she's being interviewed about whether or not she was sleeping with the then married prosecutor, and she was playing coy about what do you mean by sleeping with and what do you mean by staying and visiting. It's like, okay, just like, and that
Depends on what you mean by is.
well,
Yeah.
I mean, the Jordan Peterson meme can only hit so hard, but this is like it's a
Oh,
very
I was
clear.
thinking Bill Clinton.
Oh shit, yeah, that's right. Good point. I forgot about that entirely. So the
Peterson too, to a degree, but
yeah, but you get where I'm going with that, right? Is
yeah,
like
oh
is
for
that
sure.
but that doesn't, like, I think what we're dealing with as far as a culture right now, and I'm going to zoom out and come back in because you also have like a kind of a thesis statement attached to this, is that I believe that our culture is specifically the West is undergoing a series of moral injuries that are causing it to lose mental capabilities. Our faculties and facilities and organizations that are supposedly there to promote intelligence and academias and whatever are actually getting dumber and they're getting worse at things. And the people who are succeeding in those environments in many ways, like, and this is how it gets really simple in accusations. People have PhD level laurels and bestseller books about subjects that are not only not well written or probably not even authentic, but but they're just accepted on cultural face values. I'll use example like Ibram X. Kendi. Ibram X. Kendi's
Right.
thesis on how to not be on how to be an anti-racist is pay me or you're a racist. That's his thesis.
Yeah,
He's
it's rent seeking. Yeah,
exactly. He doesn't present an argument. He has a metaphorical gun to your head and say, "Pay me so I don't call you a racist." That is what he is. That is so. See, and we've been trying to approach intelligent conversation, or I think the West has particularly been taken advantage of for its own qualities, particularly intellectual charity, right? So you present your idea. I try to understand it as best as possible. I assume that you and I are honest interlocutors in this conversation, but really you're lying and you're just using it to legitimize your position. And
Right.
I've seen it happen in many places. It's a very simple entryism. Why can't we have it my way? Because you're actually immoral. Now get out. And they go, I don't like that. And you go, I don't care. So
I want to bring up an example of one of my favorite academics. This will sound like a tangent, but it isn't. Relating to something I think you were talking about before we started recording, but the relationship between power and money and these explorations. My favorite academic is this gentleman named
contemporary.
Yes.
Okay.
I had the pleasure and the honor of interviewing him, in fact.
Wonderful.
Because no one's interested in the classics and in philology. So random podcasters like me could be like, hey, I love your book. Can I talk to you about it? And he was willing to come on. But
I will disagree with you, man. We are the minds of our generation. Like,
Well,
and it sounds so arrogant and so foolish, but like Washington was a human being too. Okay.
Well, I
So,
bring him up because he's an interesting example of an academic who's been at Harvard for the last 30 years or whatever. This book is not cheap and also free online. He puts out all of his writings for free online. He and one of his conditions for coming on and talking to me was that no money be made by it. And he said at the end, he's like, I really worry about the involvement of money in academics and the way in which it can corrupt things. And I think everybody in academia has this sense from the way that research grants kind of work. And it biases things.
yeah. Okay. So who's the author?
His name is Greg Nosh, and he's a classicist philologist. No real political bent in his work. It's just straight nerding out over the ancient Greeks, which I love.
It's fantastic. Yeah.
Iliad, Odyssey, Plato, that Hesiod, that kind of stuff. Aeschylus. I can't recommend him highly enough. And there are other academics out there like that. One of my other favorite, I will say, scientists was a guy named Justin O. Schmidt, who one day was struck by divine inspiration. He said, you know what we don't have but need is a subjective scale about the relative pain of insect stings. And so he went about...
You talked about this guy before.
Yes. Yeah, I love talking about it. But it's like, you don't need... I think he happens to be an academic, but you don't need to be an academic to get that crazy idea in your head and say, I'm going to start stinging myself with every kind of insect I can get my hands on and keep a diary of what they're all like. Or to just read really old books really slowly, or read German books and translate them into English, or vice versa. And it's like people who do that as amateurs in the classical sense of for the love of the thing, I think is, to your point about our institutions being corrupted by power. And I think what we've really seen in the last 2 years, 3 years, was that emphasized in medicine.
Medicine is a good example. I mean, medicine is an easy place where the money is. You there is certain issues to be had, and that's an easy place to lay it out. There's a line that I've brought up multiple times that it's one of those lines from a book that just kind of sticks. And that was a line by Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged, where she talked about using this metaphor of like a mother bird plucking all the feathers out of its child and then expecting it to fly. And I have had the tragedy of meeting people and I in a sense, like, even like as a person, as I have a genuine sense of like tragedy in some of these people that I've met who have come out of higher education with their degrees and their laurels and whatever, that are so mentally broken, I don't think they can be healed. Like they are completely incapable of handling information anymore.
Yeah,
and
it's like the Yuri Bezmenov description.
Exactly. And so the whole demoralization and able to tell, like, and it was tragic. And I'll put it that, I'll leave it at that. And I mean, I have encountered people who that I've known for an extended window of time. So it wasn't like I just met them once at a gas station when they were having a mental breakdown. I meant like I've known them for a while, and I knew this. I've met people who came out of academia where it would have been better is if they had never stepped foot in school, because whatever happened there destroyed their mind. They were completely incapable. They were essentially rendered completely incapable of functioning as an adult and a
Right.
human being and engaging in normal things like, paying your bills, buying groceries, thinking at all. And it was tragic. And so that's me being a little aggressive. However,
Yeah.
collectively speaking, I collectively speaking, what I'm saying is that I like collectively, as far as a whole in the West, is that we are being forced to undergo demoralizing moral injuries, like have a debate with somebody who doesn't understand the difference between a man and a woman, or refuses to understand that kind of thing,
Right.
or not even refuses but worships themselves in some way, or like it's like we have to have an intellectual debate with a person that we know who is both a narcissist and a pathological liar, and expect to play the farce that they are not. That's what I'm
Well,
talking about as far as an intellectual level. Like, there are some things that you cannot win in the battleground of ideas, and I've been to war, and I can
well,
tell you exactly what I'm talking about.
it's interesting. I've been fortunate enough to never run into someone in my personal life who was quite that dysfunctional. I know generally what you're speaking about, though,
Mm-hmm.
because you see certain people, it feels as if they've been programmed by repetition to,
Sure.
on certain cues, have certain reactions. And so
Mm-hmm.
they can't have a debate about gender, for example,
Mm-hmm.
without certain cues inducing like prepared and primed perceptions of sexism,
Sure.
or
Sure. Sure. Mm-hmm.
on immigration, xenophobia, and just certain words, and those words are bad. They don't do the Ralph Waldo Emerson thing of like putting aside the label of evil in the exploration to see if it be evil or what is evil.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for better or for worse, I don't know how limited to the present this is. My
That is a good exception. Yeah.
because my a book I have come to love more with every passing reading is classic philosophical nerd book, Plato's Republic,
Mm-hmm.
which is of course not advocating the just city, as you know, contra Karl Popper and who's the kindly inquisitor's guy, Jonathan Rausch.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a roadmap to tyranny or whatever, but it's taking seemingly ridiculous positions seriously, and entertaining them without accepting them on their face.
Okay.
To say, what do I say in response to a Thrasymachus who says justice is just the benefit of the stronger? Justice is not real, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Justice is only the will to power and excuses that justify and rationalize why some people have more and others have less.
Yeah.
And I have been meaning to. I've been on a bit of a break from the caffeine stream because I've been chatting with Jack about other stuff on the Pater podcast. But I've been meaning to try to arrange a conversation with a flat earther, and
Okay.
not for the purpose of trying to catch him. There's one in particular I have in mind. Not trying to catch him out, but to genuinely ask questions. And my assumption is that at the end of the conversation, we won't, neither of us will have changed the other's minds, but
Mm-hmm.
just laid out the arguments for and against, and had the opportunity to say, what's the counter position to this?
Again, to engage in true academics,
Yeah.
in the true
And
battleground of ideas. Yeah,
and it's
absolutely.
so tempting to say, why should I have to engage with a flat earther?
Well, you don't have to, but that's not
Yeah.
how this world works.
Well, but you don't
Mm-hmm.
have to, but there's a sense of, if a flat earther goes about saying flat earth stuff,
Yeah.
and won't someone rid me of this flat earther? Won't someone deal with him?
Sure.
If are they ruining society without doing this? Um, there's an opportunity to, as Christopher Hitchens said in one of his more famous and I thought articulate speeches, not that he's not articulate elsewhere, but particularly so in his defense of hate speech, um, how do you know the Earth is round? How can you prove that? How do you know evolution is true and it isn't intelligent design? How do you know the Holocaust really happened?
Mm-hmm.
What I love particularly about flat Earth, as opposed to the Holocaust or intelligent design, is that it's almost apolitical by definition. You know,
Okay,
like
yeah.
like who benefits from the lie of the round Earth?
It's yeah.
Nobody.
It's not. It doesn't have a very. It doesn't have a villain, is what it is. It doesn't. It doesn't
Exactly
technically have like, and that's one of the issues that you deal with. What we colloquially refer to as like conspiracy theories is there's always a villain,
right.
or
It's like
sometimes.
why is NASA trying to convince us the Earth is round? And now, what's funny is that there actually are interesting arguments. So I'll give one just because it's fun to bring up.
Mm-hmm,
There was a gentleman who set up a camera on a tripod. Talk
mm-hmm.
about minimalist science here.
Yep.
On the edge of a lake, one of the Great Lakes in your home territory,
Mm-hmm.
and he did some napkin calculations of this is the curvature of the Earth. We're losing 1 foot over 12 miles squared or whatever it was. I'm sure I'm remembering the numbers wrong. But he did the calculation saying this is how much feet you should lose vertically over the horizon over 60 miles or
Okay.
over 100 miles, whatever.
Yep.
And so he set up a camera on the tripod on a clear day, zoomed in really, really far, and looked at the buildings on the other side of this lake and said, hey, I can see things that I should not be able to see by the curvature of the Earth. Now, that is interesting. There are, off the top of my head, 3 possibilities. One, he did the math wrong. That's the most obvious example. And I think the most likely example. You just did the math on the curvature wrong.
Yeah.
Option 2, there's some light bending going on, maybe a little bit more than you expected. They tried to account for refraction. Is it the right word? I don't know. They tried to account for that and said that doesn't explain how much more we can see.
Mm-hmm.
Or option 3, the Earth is not the shape we think it is. Maybe it's not flat. Maybe it's just a lot larger. That would be a really weird error to have made for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
But it's possible, you know? And
Yeah.
to explore these possibilities, I don't think flat Earth necessarily follows from that, but it could. And to I think the art of philosophy is the art of practicing the repression of your immediate repugnance, of your immediate rejection of hypotheses you don't like. And when someone says, I think the Earth is really flat, instead of saying, that's insane, saying, interesting, why do you think that? And you can do that with communists. You can do that with fascists.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a win-win because, one, it's possible they might have an interesting argument. Maybe not the complete worldview is correct, but they have one little bit of interesting information. They're like, I didn't know that Stalin was planning to invade Germany, and so Germany's invasion was reactive. It doesn't follow that the Holocaust didn't happen, as some people like to do. But, you can learn little bits of things that you didn't know before.
Yes.
But second of all, if you begin by taking their position seriously, your response becomes taken much more seriously. And you're saying, you know what? I don't think your argument about flat Earth is compelling because here's another hypothesis for this. Or
again, what I think you're bringing up is I think you're bringing up what the purpose of academics is supposed to be, is that we engage each other in giving each other intellectual charity and in good faith. We have conversations. The thing that has destroyed the West is that we did not figure out who was dishonest quick enough. That's I mean, it's not like the West is gone. I'm not going to be completely black-pilled about the subject, but what I'm arguing for or against in this case is that some people you can engage. Sometimes it is appropriate to engage in that kind of conversation where you give them the floor to have the legitimacy. We all come together and we have a seat at the table, right? Sometimes you don't. It would be immoral to give somebody a position at the table. And I think that's immoral. Yeah. If you know a person is a pathological liar, You should not engage them as if they were an academic, because the only thing that's going to do is it's going to injure the world.
So that's an interesting hypothesis. There are a couple different ways you can approach it, and I think the temptation, the sort of allure of the ring of power here, is what we could call expediency, and that begins with a presumption of what should happen, and sees threats to that as like we need to not let this happen.
Okay.
The going back to academics and the corruption of money, you could have a conversation with a sociopath, and now there is a danger, of course, of them lying, and some portion of the people who hear their lies believe them and are deceived.
Sure.
But if your intention going into a conversation with this person is to have a particular effect on the audience that that might be listening, like that's not a pure academic intention of the kind we're talking about either.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
And I agree with your. I think that's a really good distinction. Is that you have to be honest. You must be honest with yourself on your intentions for having the conversation to begin with.
Right, and there are ways to. Oh, I don't mean to sound like too much of a fanboy, but there's another great Hitchens line from the same speech, incidentally, where he says, "I reject the kind offer of protection that was so generously offered by the other side," because they were having a conversation about censorship and hate speech. And it is implied, I listened to the whole debate some years ago, I don't remember exactly how it was said, but they offered to censor harsh criticism of Hitchens on his behalf. He says, "I reject the kind offer of protection. Anyone who wishes to say anything abusive about or to me is quite free to do so, and welcome, in fact, at their own risk." Because anybody who knows Hitchens knows how quickly critical comments of that kind can be jujitsu'd against the position. And you see that again in Plato's Republic. Socrates was, if anything, that. And people would say, "Socrates, there you go again in your sarcastic manner, always trying to trip people up in your words." And Socrates is like, "Oh, I'm not trying to do that at all. How am I doing that?" And then the sincere engagement actually disarms the sociopathic and manipulative tendencies. Not every time, obviously. He still had to drink hemlock, and
so and there are exceptions, but I'll even just go straight to the absurd. I don't have a debate with somebody who wants to try to kill me. You know what I mean?
Oh, sure, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I know that's going to the absurd, but like.
Yeah.
I am not going to have a rational conversation with somebody. I'm not going to sit down and pretend like we're having a rational conversation when there's a gun pointed to my head. It's not the same thing. Now, I might try to use wit and rhetoric to change the circumstances, but it's not an academic conversation. It is not about truth and morality in some cases. Sometimes it's completely different. So, what I'm arguing for. I guess, in a sense, what I'm arguing for is that one of the things that I think we're dealing with as far as challenges in academia is we are all, in some sense, it almost sounds contradictory, but all heart and no head, or all head and no heart, in the sense of like, because so you look at both gun culture and philosophy deal with pointless conversations. And I'm saying this a little bit sarcastically, a little bit spicy, and not spicy, a little bit assertively, in the sense of talking about in philosophy, it'd be like the whole joke of how many angels can fit on the head of a needle, or in like the gun culture, it would be usually a fruitless conversation about something that will never have any consequence in our life.
What's better, a 10 and a half or an 11 and a half?
Depends. I mean, that's just like better if you already have agreed on the metrics and you know what you're doing and you know what your measurements are. And if the amount of space that you have to put that rifle in is only big enough to fit a 10.5-inch barrel, then a 10.5-inch barrel is better. If that's, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
The problem that people have on that end is that they don't really set the conditions for victory and one way or another on a conversation. Like the most classic one from when I was a kid was 9mm versus 45. Was like they were all very roundabout arguments, and the answer is like, well, then just go shoot someone with a 9mm and then go shoot someone with a 45 and see which one works. You know what I mean? Like
it's empiricism, man.
I'm not.
Do it for the science.
You see what I'm saying? I'm not being I'm being sort of metaphorical in the sense,
Yeah.
but like, those are like we were young trying to figure out how we were having conversations and rationalizing those decisions, but ultimately, it comes down to those are not good examples. A good example would be ones that are purely trivial, and I don't know how to.
Yeah.
I can't think of a good example, but like metaphorical or hypothetical examples of if like the grid goes down and the world lights on fire and zombies. Zombies is the perfect example. What is the best tool for killing zombies, right? And you're like...
Well, that's obviously a Revolution 22. Come on. That is a serious debate.
You know what I mean? But like, you know what I mean? Like, okay, I remember when I was a kid and me and some friends got into a really stupid argument over who would win in a fight, Cloud Strife or Master Chief. Like, dude, you're kids. It's none of it. At the end of the day, none of it really matters. And so philosophy, I think philosophy gets accused of engaging in fruitless, meaningless, pointless conversations.
Living in the clouds, so to speak.
The ivory tower, this kind of things. And while there are grounds for it to be, while there are cases where that accusation lands, it very often produces throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and as a result, we have a entire population that is incapable of basic thinking.
Well, I think you've offered me possibly a beautiful segue to bring it back to what we were talking about in the first place here, which is objectivity.
Exactly.
And what does truly matter? I was having a conversation with a foreman of mine who was a Marine sniper before he became an electrician. And we were talking about different rifle calibers for deer and elk and stuff. And he's as much of a nerd about ballistics and stuff as I am. But he said, like, take a 270 or 30-06. At the end of the day, he said it's like Ford versus Chevy. So much of it comes down to personal preference, shot placement, and training and practice matter so much more than the precise differences between 7 PRC and 7 Rem Mag. But that's the extreme example because it's the same freaking rifle. I own a 7 PRC, and I am firmly in the camp that 7 PRC is objectively better than 7 Rem Mag because I'm biased, and I own that, so it's better. But really, they're shooting more or less the same bullet, more or less the same speed. Is there some difference in bullets shape? Yes. Is there some difference in ballistics? Probably. Does it matter? Probably not. Unless you're shooting at 1,700 yards and beyond, and then it actually might matter. I don't know, but I'm not shooting that far. But but if you are shooting at that distance, then these kinds of things do matter. If you're trying to kill a deer, it doesn't. But what matters is very, as we were talking about before with language games, it is context dependent, and there isn't only one legitimate end in living. You might be trying to kill a deer at 120 yards in your deer stand in Pennsylvania, in which case you could use a freaking crossbow for all we care, or you could be trying to break some record at hitting a 3 foot by 3 foot steel plate at 2 miles. Those details suddenly matter a lot. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin is completely irrelevant to 99.99999% of the population. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily illegitimate to talk about it as something that matters to that 0.0001% of, medieval theological historians whose lives sort of revolve around those kinds of debates. Where does our jurisdiction come from to say that doesn't matter? Now, where it comes into our jurisdiction is when people like that, who are talking about angels on heads, or in a more modern context, talking about the precise numbers of genders that exist in the human species,
Mm-hmm.
say, and we want the legal power to fire people who disagree with us.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
and that's, and then we're back to the question of corrupting the conversation with power.
Yeah.
There was I believe it was Douglas Murray.
Mm-hmm.
I could be wrong. It might have been someone else, but it's the sort of point Douglas Murray would make, where he was talking about the COVID regime. And he's saying the beautiful thing about science and about medicine is, sort of borrowing from Jonathan Rauch, there's no final say. There's no final answer. There's no correct answer. We're constantly learning new things, refining our knowledge, improving treatments, developing our knowledge, and so forth. And its legitimacy comes from that openness. It comes from that transparency and that publicity. Conversely, the legitimacy of government comes from its finality, comes from its, like, we say this is the law and it applies to everybody, from this point forward. So when you combine the state with the mechanism of science, you get the worst of both worlds. You delegitimize both at the same time, where the law is constantly changing to try to keep up with science, but they're using force of the state to say you and you and you can't participate in this conversation or hear what's going on in science. As one spokesman said, that conversation has already been had. The answer, we have the answer, we know it, the case is closed. It's like, that is contrary to the spirit of science and the history of science, for that matter. Yeah. And so the combination of those two is the problem.
When what we're witnessing is that what people refer to as this idea of science has become science.tm/ it's a religion. It's functioning as a religion. Right. It's providing a religious outlook for some people.
Well, and here,
and then and then you're getting you're getting a failure on the separation of church and state. Is what you're doing. Is you're essentially getting the fusion of those two things. Is that science for people have become a religion, and they believe that because they don't think of it as a religion, because they do not think of their religious beliefs as religious beliefs, they think that they are permitted to use those religious beliefs as a legitimacy, as a forced form of authoritarianism in their government operation.
And do you know the name of this religion?
I mean, it has many names, but it's just self-worship. It's
I would call it, and I think I have good reason to do this, the Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment. Okay. Now we're getting somewhere. So counter-enlightenment, and so the Enlightenment and its obsession with rationalism.
Which we'll say, because the Enlightenment's other name is the Age of Reason. Yep. Thomas Paine wrote about this. It was very popular at that time in France as well as in the United States. But it goes back much further. Most historians will say that the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, began with René Descartes and his discourse on method. Because that is when he took the foundation of knowledge and took it off of God, where it was at the time. And instead of justifying reason by appeal to God, he said he inverted that. He said, no, God is justified by reason. And we can argue about the spuriousness or legitimacy of his reasons. He's not the first person to try to give reasons for God. I mean, Aquinas is quite famous for that. You have St. Anselm offering very early arguments back in like the 4th century. People have been doing that for a long time, but it was a new thing in the medieval age, we could say, to put the gods on the foundation of reason. But there was someone who did it before Descartes. And we mentioned him earlier, and that was Socrates in Euthyphro. When asking the question.
He asked it, he challenged the legitimacy of a thing being God if it was bound to a moral system outside of itself.
Well, he asked the question, like, is something pious because the gods will it, or do the gods will it because it is pious? And here we can think of pious as a synonym for moral in this context. And he, like, to ask the question sort of implies that the answer is that morality is in some sense older or more basic than the gods. And that's certainly the way that Socrates himself seemed to argue and to live.
Mm-hmm.
But my own belief is that Friedrich Nietzsche, is essentially correct. When in one of his first books, actually, the Birth of Tragedy, he argued that Socratism is the original spirit of science, and it is a faith in the salvific power of reason, essentially.
Okay. Yeah.
And everything that came from the Enlightenment is just building off of that hope, and the idea that if we just pursue knowledge hard enough, if we pursue truth, if we try to be objective enough, then we can resolve our problems without violence, without bloodshed. And this was, I think, put in very mythic imagery by Carl Sagan in describing science as a candle in the dark.
Yeah.
But before science, all was darkness and horror, and we hated each other and fought and killed each other over nothing, over things that didn't matter because we couldn't see. But with science, we can begin to see, and we can begin to lose our fear.
Yeah.
And if you don't mind quoting from Frankfurt School scholars, Adorno and Horkheimer, who wrote The Dialectic of the Enlightenment, defined the Enlightenment as the escape from fear and the emancipation of humanity by means of knowledge. I'm not probably quoting that verbatim, but the fear seems to have a big part of that.
Yeah, it's a common argument that I've heard made a lot of times, that like people believe in God because they're afraid of death. And
yes,
and
was
like
it Becker?
I can't remember.
I think that's Becker. Yeah.
It's
also Marx.
I mean, it's not exact like and we can even go back a little bit further in time. Before Socrates was writing, the Book of Job existed, and the Book of Job has the exact same moral argument at the end. Not the exact same that the Euthyphro argument has, but it has a similar argument, where God is speaking to Job and saying, "I literally created everything that you could possibly comprehend. What ground do you have to criticize me on morality? I am that which created morality. You cannot accuse me of my own thing." He's essentially making that argument to Job in this sense of,
what's curious about Job, though, also is he's not saying he created morality because Job's friends are saying you clearly deserved this because God only punishes evildoers. You clearly must have, and Job is denying guilt. Job is saying, I did nothing wrong. Why did this happen? And his friend says, well, you clearly must have done something wrong because God has punished you in this way. And if like, and when God descends as his voice in the whirlwind, before addressing Job, he addresses his friends and says, who are these who speak without knowledge? You have not spoken rightly of me. It's like they were defending him. They were defending God, and God says, "You don't know what you're talking about." So there's this sense that the morality of God is actually beyond human comprehension, and the reason is powerless to reach that place.
Okay, that's I'm familiar. Okay, so this is kind of getting into your argument a little bit that spurned this conversation, that has to do with challenges with the inherent subjectivity of language and our access to objective information. So let's start with a series of kind of like assumption level questions. Like, are you positing that there is such thing as objectivity? Yes or no?
Sure. I would accept that there is such thing as an objective view, but that's like the void.
I'm not talking about I'm not talking about our ability to perceive a thing objectively. I'm saying that like, for example, that, like, this is objectively a pen. Whether or not I perceive it as a pen, whether I subjectively think of it as a pen, it still is a pen
Sure.
by the nature of the definition, or maybe
Yeah.
colors or
I
numbers, or
I I believe that pen exists apart from its image on my screen. Yes.
fair. Or
Mhm.
yeah. So, like, because I think there's a huge error that's made in particularly the post-enlightenment, postmodern era, and that is the replacement of objectivity with subjectivity. And like, I guess I've spent my years dealing with the idea of like postmodernism, and now I kind of feel like that's a young man's game. That postmodernism is kind of like a dragon or like a harlot with herpes. If it traps some people, and once they're gone, they're gone. You can't pull them out. I mean, I'm being a little bit like facetious on that, but I kind of think of it. I think of certain like ideologies and belief systems in a way like a dragon or a demon or something, that it captures people, and you pray and you hope, like medicine, that they get out of it before it destroys them. Now, of course, I do come from a bit of the I am coming from Christianity, but
But there are many Christianities too. So like the Christianity, the Platonic mysticism of Augustine is not the same flavor of Christianity as the systematic theology of an Aquinas.
I am agreeing with your statement, but I still think it needs clarification. I think I'm agreeing with you, and this is where it comes in, is that there is like Christianity in the sense of it is the amalgam of the perfection of God and the imperfection of man, because it is the revelation, the God revealing himself to man. And so because mankind has fallen, it is going to have multiple warped and twisted versions of that because of the noetic effects of sin, because we do not have access to objective reality.
Noetic effects. What do you mean by noetic effects?
Greek gnosis. In other words, because mankind is infected with sin or has sinned, he has lost a part of his mental faculty.
So is this NOE or is this GNOE?
I think it's typically, let's see, it would be typically noetic, Noetic.
So this is from the root nos.
And so let's see. I'm just pulling it up. I know Greek enough, but I'm not specific on this etymology. But the noetic effects of sin would be, I mean, it's kind of common in Reformed circles, to be clear, but it's this argument that it's essentially a claim that mankind's ability to know things is diminished. One of the well-known theses of Alvin Plantinga.
Okay.
Right, and so
I'm familiar with Plantinga. So I ask because, and this ties back to my acquaintance, if I can call it that, my hero, I suppose, Greg Naj, who speaks at some length about nous in the context of the Odyssey, and his compatriot Doug Frame talking about the etymological relationship between nous, which is usually translated as mind, or the mind of Odysseus in that case, and nostos, the homecoming. And there's some nerdish roots to that. It's sometimes translated as connection. And I ask because there's this other Greek word, gnosis, Gnos,
from Gnosticism.
Well, right, but that's a tricky word too, because at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, the know thyself is this word gnosis. Yeah. But there, it doesn't mean what Gnostics mean, which is ironic. They always twist things. Gnosis in the Apollonian context means knowledge from direct experience. Like when I go outside and it's raining, my knowledge that it is raining doesn't come from being told. It doesn't come from a weather report. It doesn't come from language at all. It comes from I am literally experiencing it. And so when Gnostics talk about the demiurge and all this other stuff, they're in fact talking about knowledge that is the antithesis of what is implied in the Greek word.
Yeah.
But when they talk about noetic effects of sin,
diminishment of the mind.
I suppose, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, so so that very simply is we are all impacted with some sort of mental injury that has diminished our mind. Our mind is not in a perfect state, and so
Okay.
now this is a Reformed theology position. I think it's well. I mean, I know Alvin Plantinga wrote about it. Calvin is an influencer for a lot of Reformed theology, and so not Calvin Klein, but like Calvin Long, whatever. I just
John
can't.
Calvin.
Yeah,
It's a
John.
very different Calvin.
Just someone's gonna eventually do this where you get like classic theologians rebranded as like TikTok influencers.
As
So
a Homer nerd,
yeah,
the amount of times people send me like Homer Simpson type stuff
ah,
is
but
tedious. Yeah,
yeah, and I know,
I feel you.
but I've also brought this up recently, and it's like one of those jokes and memes that I saw recently that just has like it hit me like a lightning bolt, and that was you got this picture, these two pictures, and the top is like this very well put together couple, or like it's all like line drawings, so like they've got an ascot on, and they're all very dignified looking, and it goes people who study philosophy, and then the bottom one is like true actual philosophers, and it's this dude like pulling his hair out, smoking a cigarette, drinking a bottle of bourbon.
Oh yeah,
He's just losing. He's just completely losing his mind. Like he's just complete crazy. And I think sometimes I find a little chuckle in that. That's probably closer to home than I'm willing to admit.
Well, the example of a Christianity that I find more compelling, sort of speaks to the meme a little bit, is Kierkegaard.
Okay.
And Kierkegaard is, of course, famous for his leap of faith. He was sort of a proto-existentialist in some ways, but he wouldn't have accepted the label with Sartre in that way. But he says, at the end of the day, you essentially can't justify faith by reason. And perhaps you shouldn't even want to do that. Perhaps that would be putting reason on too high of a pedestal. And I don't know if he says that or not, but regardless, he doesn't think it can be done. And my fear, and this is not just me, this is not just Kierkegaard, this is also Nietzsche. At the bottom of the well of objectivity is that dragon you were talking about. Because the truly objective perspective, the most objective perspective, is neutrality, is the void, and is the unity of the universe into nothingness, the breaking down of the barriers that distinguish one thing from another thing.
So that's where I think a lot of this goes in religiously different directions, because I think at the bottom of the well you will find one of two things, and you actually don't have ultimate authority of which one you acquire. It's not completely arbitrary. I don't want to go down that one, but it's that you will either find God or you will find the abyss, because there's nothing else that can fit that role. And so now now we're kind of getting off topic a little bit in like the legitimacy of rationalizing a belief in God. I want to make sure we're not going that direction completely, because we've been talking quite a bit about objectivity and language, particularly on how we have language. And I think and this is where I think in concern for moral perception, we get derailed. And this is why I wanted to have specifically this conversation with you, is because I wanted to make sure that we're not derailing the value of not like a train conductor or anything, but of like it's a pretty big claim, is what I'm saying. How am I going to tie this together one more time? The world where I think we are at in the timeline of human history is that we are seeing the end of Charles Taylor's secular age, that the age of secularism is coming to an end, particularly by his definition of the secular. And now this is not an argument for the legitimacy of a position or not. I think that the question that you raised is an indicative of the times that we live in, with the conundrums that people are dealing with, the problems, the mental, moral, and intellectual problems that people are encountering. And the way that the secular age is described by Charles Taylor is that belief in God is one option amongst many, and all of them are equally valid. And the thing that you push for, that are things that people pursue in beliefs, during this, now Charles Taylor's not arguing that this is the right way of things, but this is
Mhm.
how what secularism in the 20th century was like, and that it's not you're not measuring the legitimacy of a person's belief on the basis of of their rational, but on how authentic they are. Authenticity is the primary tool.
And is authenticity, um, I assume he means authenticity in a sense that is measured by behavior, correct?
Maybe, I don't know. I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but I
Okay.
haven't. I'm not going to put words in his mouth on that one. But there,
Because,
the what we're
I mean,
dealing, yeah,
from a Christian frame, I think that the secular age is perhaps a meaningful category. But if you step out of the Christian frame, where the Christian God is the one true God,
mm-hmm.
um, there was no secular age. It was the replacement of one God with another God, the God of reason. Reason became the salvific power, was in fact personified in a number of statues. They made statues in France during the French Revolution of reason. They
Well,
tried to turn a temple into a cathedral into a temple of reason.
yeah, and then
And
it wasn't at Notre Dame. They tried to turn Notre Dame into a temple. Was it? It might have
it was
been Notre.
probably a number of them. You're probably right.
I'm pretty sure
Um,
Napoleon tried to do that at Notre Dame. However, um, maybe we need to clarify in some sense what we're talking about when we talk about Enlightenment philosophers, because
mhm,
there seems to be
yes.
this weird internet battle over whether or not they were
Oh, yes.
deists or theists or theonomists,
I
or they
was
were
just having very friendly and interesting conversation debate with a friend earlier today
Mhm.
over whether Kant was an Enlightenment philosopher or the premier anti-flight Enlightenment philosopher.
Fair. Yeah.
And
So,
I think he was the distillation of Enlightenment philosophy.
okay.
But that there are people who make the other case, Stephen
Mhm.
Hicks being one respected gentleman who does that.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm doing this is I want to make sure that we establish, like, I forever want to put to death this idea of like science versus religion. It is the, you know what I mean? Like, I forever want to see that
Yes.
it's like a fourth grader's argument that like it's not convincing. It's a very pretty story, dude. And this is
This is
one.
a feeling like an advertisement for, I'll just put it out there. The book that my essay on the Enlightenment
Mhm,
is coming out in also has an essay, which you can read online now at Pater,
mhm,
the website PH2T3R,
mhm.
um, called The Spiritual Origins of Science,
Okay.
where I say that science actually began as and always was an essentially religious undertaking,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
that the
It's
failures of science recently are symptoms of the departure from that spirit, which, by the way, doesn't have to be Christian.
fair.
It was historically, but was not necessarily for in some cases.
And
But
because
something
yeah.
can be religious in a positive sense without being Christian. I think there are also positive examples of Christian spirituality in that pursuit of the virtues of humility and curiosity and wanting to
Yes.
learn more about the world and so forth.
Two classic examples, that where this kind of plays out is Buddhism, how the West perceives Buddhism, and another one would be like Stoicism. Like,
Mm.
I like the aesthetics of Stoicism, of having self control and being in control over oneself and one's mind, and making decisions about things and not being pulled this way and that by the whims of the earth and your experiences and whatever. I do appreciate that, but then I do not agree with the metaphysical claim that exists in Stoicism. Or like, another one would be kind of like there are things that I can admire about belief systems without holding to the whole belief system.
Right.
You know,
I'm not a big fan of Buddhism, with the exception of Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism seems to be somehow significantly different than the rest of Buddhism. Stoicism, I have very few positive feelings about. I think it can be useful therapy for certain people. I think it's particularly vapid under Ryan Holiday, who I enjoy bashing at every opportunity I can.
Let's remove him because I think we've talked about that in the past. Let's make sure, but because that would be a straw man if we were just going to use Ryan Holiday.
Yes, he doesn't speak for Stoicism or anything. You'd be much better off with Zeno or Epictetus or Seneca, and they have serious points.
And I've read Seneca and I've read some of Epictetus, and so I'm familiar with their arguments too. So, but kind of going back into the Enlightenment. Ultimately, or not ultimately, is just like in that sense, I want to put to death this weird comic book history of the world that has been painted a million times about Galileo and the church and how the church was against science. And it's like, I'm just going to break it to some people. If you believe that history story, that like Galileo and the science thing, like your perspective of world history is equivalent to a Spider-Man comic book.
There's a phenomenal little lecture. It's only like 20 minutes long, if I remember correctly, by Dr. Ryan Reeves. If you aren't familiar with the history of Galileo, do yourself a favor and go listen to Ryan Reeves, Reeves, explain that. It's very short. It's very interesting, actually. And it's much more complicated than the sort of Dawkinsian take on
the the Dawkins take is probably what I'm talking about, because it's just like that did not only I think one of the best breakdowns of it that I've ever seen was done by a professor I knew who described it as Rudyard Kipling, How the Leopard Got Its Spots. That's what you're doing. You're telling a nice story about how religion came about through scientific means, but it's a story. It's just a cute tale. There's no academics in it. There's no science in it. There's no philosophy in it. It's just a funny story. So, and why I'm making this emphasis here is because there seems to be this weird battle that people participate, particularly on the internet, being like, the Enlightenment philosophers were theologians, and they were Christians, and they were atheists, and they were, and it's like, it's almost like a categorical ad hominem. Is probably what I'm saying.
Let me throw something out to see if this is maybe more interesting to you than the Dawkinsian take. The real struggle between science and Christianity is not like, how old is the Earth? Did evolution happen, or this other nonsense, or the treatment of Galileo, especially given how many scientists the Catholic Church produced. Punnett, who created Punnett squares and founded genetics, essentially was a priest. But it's the question of like, how are the things that are outside of the domain of scientific confirmation and study, do they cease to exist in legitimacy and polite conversation? I.e., if it can't be demonstrated scientifically, is it not real? And this is not just a question of God, because God is outside the domain of science. What I tried to highlight in my essay is that the validity and utility of science itself comes into question. Because if you look at science, it actually doesn't do that much for us in terms of like Dawkins was famously asked, what was the evidence that science works? And he says, planes fly, cars drive, computers compute. It's like, that wasn't science that did that, though. That was engineers. And engineers have been engineering things for thousands of years before science was a thing. Scientists...
Taleb makes a similar argument in Anti-Fragile, where tinkerers, not scientists in lab coats, are making things. Yes,
precisely. And tinkering is not the same as science in methodology or in purpose or in spirit. And this is not to bash engineers or scientists, but the desire to do science is a spiritual thing. It's like, we should know more about the universe, and it is good to pursue knowledge. It is good to, I might know that if I turn on this switch and if I hook electrical wires up in this way, I can make lights go on. 95% of electricians have no idea how electricity works. And a fair number of electrical engineers also don't know, but science is not content with just making things work. It wants to understand how it works. and it's the pursuit of the knowledge. And they only create things incidentally in the pursuit of that knowledge. Meanwhile, engineers only find out how things work as a means to the end of making things work.
Yes.
You know, and it turns out the two are less, they are necessary to some degree, but they're less integrally necessary than many people imagine they are.
Okay.
So like you could make a plane that flies and believe that it's the Bernoulli principle that makes wings fly. Turns out it's not. The Bernoulli's principle does not make wings work in the way that they teach you that they work in high school. It's not totally wrong, but it's more complicated. You know, it's one of those things where that if you assume that it will work, it will function, it will probably fly okay, but your understanding will be off. And at the end of the day, that desire to do science is not itself scientifically justified. What scientific conclusion gave you the idea that it is good to do science?
Well, you're asking scientists what we're referring to as the scientific method or science to do something it can't do. It's I mean
right.
And now
right. This is where the burning principle of the Enlightenment, everything that is not rationally justified should be done away with, becomes a self-defeating undertaking.
Yeah.
And I think this is really where postmodernism began to get its legs, is they correctly recognized that. They said that the whole notion of the Enlightenment is built upon presuppositions and desires that are not themselves rationally justified. Put in mathematical terms, they discovered Gödel's incompleteness theorem in values. You cannot have a complete system, mathematically or otherwise, which means you can also not have an objective system.
So this is the so this is postmodernism's criticism of sort of the modernist Enlightenment era by coming to the conclusion that you cannot have a complete system in mathematics. Like I don't know, maybe
this is Gödel, yeah.
Okay.
He said that basically all mathematical systems. So math is basically the science of determining whether statements are identical or not. Is 1 + 1 identical with 2? Can we find, like, what are logically consistent statements given a set of initial axioms? So the question is, where do those axioms come from?
Oh, okay.
Where do we get the idea that 1 is equal to 1, for example?
Okay. Yeah. I that makes a lot more sense now.
And what
it seems like a really complicated way to say something that's really simple, though. Maybe I'm wrong. Let me keep listening.
Sure. Well, what Gödel's incompleteness theorem demonstrated within the language of mathematics is that you cannot get to those initial axioms that are required for mathematics or logic to even be possible using mathematics, or at least not using the mathematical system that you are trying to complete, that you're trying to demonstrate.
Yes.
So the incompleteness theorem says there cannot be a complete system. Now, I believe, and this is my personal position, that mathematics is a second order derivative of language. It is, in a sense, a pure grammar. It is language that has been purged of as much subjective language as possible. We replace discrete objects with categories, essentially. Instead of saying 5 apples, which could be broken down any number of ways, a discrete fruit, weight, the number of seeds, with, I don't know, with an abstract category, which we call 5. And once we purify these concepts by translating them into a kind of Platonic world of pure forms, we can manipulate them and arrive at true objective knowledge. Okay. But it gets tricky when you translate that back into the real world.
So yeah, okay. So in that sense, we have access to various forms of objective knowledge.
Well, my belief is that the objectivity achieved in mathematics is an illusion, and we really feel the illusory nature of the illusion when you explore any statistic too closely. You know,
So
anyone in the gun world for a while should be aware of how manipulative and misleading even well-intentioned and honestly intended statistics can be. There was a statistic that was really getting on my nerves. That's not a gun one at all. A few months ago, have you heard it said, for example, that marriages today have a 50% divorce rate?
Yeah, but it's not. Yeah, I have. Yep, and I think I know where
So,
you're going, but I'm curious on how you're going to
do you
finish it.
know where that number came from?
No, I don't.
It came from a projection of where the divorce rate would wind up at the current age back in the 70s.
Okay.
I said, if rates continue, we will eventually reach a 50% divorce rate.
Okay.
And we never did. What we did reach was a 42% of marriages that ended in divorce.
Yep.
But because of the way the measurements were, it led people to believe that, like, if I get married,
I have a 50%
I have a 50% chance of divorce.
Yeah.
Is actually, I think the if you look at marriages in terms of an individual person, how likely is it that a woman, I think they chose woman for some reason, will be divorced in their life? It's like 36 or 38%, I think, was the peak. And we actually hit the peak in the 80s. It's been going down since 86, I want to say.
I'm not entirely surprised.
Yeah. And Charles Murray has some great data on this. But basically, serial divorcees, people who've been married once and then get divorced and then get married and then get divorced, and they have like 5 or 6 marriages, skew the stats in this power law distribution that makes it the average of what are the odds that a given marriage will fail is very different than the odds that a given person will become divorced. And it's a very subtle distinction when you talk about it, but it's a massive difference when you talk about the success of marriage more broadly in society. And it's like it takes a lot of like digging through, first of all, to find out where the bad statistics even come from. But second of all, like I think the people who talk about the 50% divorce rate, or I've heard people talk about 46%, and they're looking at percent of failed marriages, not percent of people who get in failed marriages, which is a lot lower, have the best of intentions. There's nothing to do with honesty. It has to do with the translation from the real world into the world of pure numbers, and then the translation of that back into the real world. It's very easy to go awry, and it turns out the accuracy of mathematics is only as good as that translation is. And there's a lot of factors to take into account in the messy, organic, real world. So the objectivity achievable in mathematics is largely an illusion.
I'm winning my argument by doing my hair. Sorry.
Touche.
I'm being sarcastic. Okay, so that helps clarify quite a bit in how you're approaching a subject that I think is important, and that is, I think now this is where statistics the gun industry is going to have its own sort of not gripe or issue with it, but one thing that's very different in the evaluation of information versus the access to information, right? And so,
can I bring up a gun example of statistics real quick?
Sure.
Because there's a company I'm a very big fan of called Discrete Ballistics.
Okay.
And they make particularly high quality subsonic bullets for 300 blackout and 8.6 blackout, which I am very excited to eventually test out their bullets in my 338 Spectre. But that notwithstanding, there was a test, a somewhat famous test, where their bullets were shot into some ballistics gel, and they didn't perform very well. They kind of went through, they didn't cause a lot of damage. And so here we had a test using science, TM, that using statistics on ballistics gel that's supposed to simulate flesh, it didn't do that great. But if you contrast the ballistics gel with the hundreds and hundreds of pictures of dead pigs and dead deer that discrete customers' clients send in and say, oh man, this deer from a 300 blackout at like 100 yards, just went down like that. It's not that the ballistics test was bad science or anything, but it's that there are certain factors. There are a lot of factors that influence the effect of a bullet on a target, whether that's a steel target at 1,500 yards or a flesh and bone and skin and fur target at 200 yards, or whatever the case may be. And the science and the statistics will only be as good as the inputs are accurate and comprehensive. And so discrete ballistics said, this is not as realistic of a test as the real world. And one of my favorite living contemporary philosophers, Matthew Crawford, who's written a number of very fine books that I highly recommend to everyone, has argued, and he might have been quoting someone else, I don't remember who, but he said, at the end of the day, the world is its own best model. And we can only, the appeal to objectivity is often the appeal to models and simplifications that ignore some of the messy complexity. And we can't escape, at the end of the day, the necessity of judgment in going about our lives and making decisions.
Okay, yeah, I can see why it would be an influential phrase, because not only does it have a bit of kind of poetry into it, but it also kind of okay. So
the discrete ballistics rephrasing would be the best model of a pig is a pig.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, and so let's go we'll go back into statistics and then go back into objectivity, and we're gonna kind of take, instead of a tangent correcting and going right back in, we're going to take steps kind of back in, because
okay.
So, one of the issues that the gun culture deals with as far as statistics is that it's not the right to bear arms or owning a firearm or the right to self-defense or whatever is not dependent in any way, shape, or form on statistics. So,
right.
We see these
all the safety nerds out there in there.
It's yeah, I mean, it like in a sense, it's kind of an interesting problem in the way that we're dealing with it. And it's weird that gun culture people keep stooping to the level of illiterate people to try to convince them something that they don't want to believe in or uninterested in, like being honest about it, I guess is probably a short way of saying it. And that's not now me, as a person who claims to be a bit of a philosopher and has to deal with like battleground of ideas, would come across as a little bit not necessarily counterproductive, but it's just, I can see why that might rub people the wrong way. There are some people who you will not convince, absent a barrel of a gun, that they do not have the right to strip you of, or they have no moral grounds upon which to strip you of your right to bear an arm.
Which, as an aside, is the most important defense of the Second Amendment, right there. You need that gun to persuade them. I'm kidding.
Yeah, but I mean, and that's the problem. Is it's literally a circular argument. The entire idea that someone can support gun control is actually not a rational argument. It's a moral one. They think they're better than you, and they want to kill you and take your stuff. It's that simple.
Well, and they think they have the statistics on their side. And first of all, most of those statistics are manipulative in the manner that we've been talking about. The worst example, I got into an argument with an Australian a couple months ago who said, "Oh, the firearm ban works really well here. Violent crime went down," and I was like,
"Yeah, but you're slaves."
Do I know your national history better than you do? Like, you had an existing downtrend in violent crime, and the assault weapons ban didn't change it.
Yeah.
It didn't accelerate it at all. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, if anything, it kind of evened out, but it was still going down. But like the things that the Australian government did to give credence to it was
Mm-hmm.
they did what's called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
So, perhaps appropriate when talking about guns to use a gun named fallacy, which is where they changed the definition of a thing in order to make their shooting look more accurate, in order to make their argument sound. So in Australia's case, they decided to change the definition of what constituted a mass shooting from 4 or more people to 3 or more people. I don't remember exactly. But
They did this in America as well.
The Justicar covered it in a video some years back. And this, who's extremely mathematically literate, more so than me, like by a lot. The manipulations of statistics require not just an understanding of the data, but also an understanding of what is not shown. So, for example, if you plot gun possession or like ease of purchasing a firearm on an x-axis and plot gun violence on the y-axis, or vice versa, y-axis to x-axis, like you are failing to incorporate so much critical information. Like, what about deterrence? You can't even get data on deterrence because it doesn't show up because the violence was deterred. You know, but the fact that it can't be measured, as we were talking about with you know, God or the spiritual justifications for science or so forth, the fact that something can't be measured empirically doesn't mean it isn't important. Yes. And there's this conflation, and this is the real danger with scientism and the Enlightenment more broadly, of if we can't measure it, it doesn't exist, or it doesn't matter.
Then and you're familiar with Hume's fork, like
the is-ought.
Is-ought divide Hume's fork.
Yes, yeah. Sometimes,
and so Hume's fork is the is-ought divide. I'm assuming you're rather familiar with the idea, the argument.
I've heard it usually called a different name, but yes.
Okay,
I'm familiar with it as Hume's guillotine, but
it might be Hume's guillotine. Yeah, I might have two things conflated.
I know what you're talking about,
but it's the is-ought divide, right? It's very simple, right? In the sense of like, so the claim of scientism would be that, or more correct, more
philosophy nerds know this as the naturalistic fallacy.
The naturalistic fallacy, or like, materialism, naturalistic materialism, where the only thing that is real is what is in existence, and everything that is not in existence is not real, and it doesn't matter. That's a really. I'm sorry, I know that's not a very good way of painting it, but essentially,
it's a tricky one because it's on the verge of tautological, but it like. The material, I've never heard someone connect materialism with Hume's guillotine that way before.
No, Hume's guillotine.
That's interesting.
I wouldn't tie naturalism or materialism to Hume's guillotine. I'm saying that materialism can't account for half of the is-ought divide. It can't account for it. Yeah, it can't account for it. Just the way that you cannot come to moral conclusions using science. You can only collect data. You can only...
Yeah. Well, I think this is where I think the language gets tricky, because there's a way that... I see what you're saying. It would be very weird to hear someone say, I think we ought to do something, and the response to be, do you think that ought exists?
Like, I agree. I agree with you.
I would be like the question feels like a category error. You know what I mean? Like assigning the quality of existence to a preference.
Okay, so morals. Okay, why is the word preference being used? I'm not really sure.
It's arbitrary. We could say preference, or we could say obligation. We could say duty. If I say I have a duty, and someone says, "Does your duty exist?" Like you know, the classic example would be like Antigone, where you know, she wants to bury her dead brother, and the king says, "The law is against that." the law exists. In what sense does the duty to bury her brother exist materially? Like existence is like the I don't know. It just seems like an inappropriate use of language. And here I'm putting preferences and duties and obligations all in one category. So I wasn't trying to do anything sneaky there.
No, I got it.
But fair point that preferences and duties are distinct.
I just wanted to make sure that I understood why you were using that word specifically, and you accomplished it. I was a little like, because I was wondering if you were making an a implication that morality and preference are the same. But
I think in many cases there are. I think I personally believe preference is sufficient to establish morality, but there are certainly moral theories that are beyond preference.
Okay.
So like Kantian deontology says actually preference has nothing to do with morality. And then utility is like more or less related, I suppose. My understanding is that there are 5 major schools of moral philosophy, and you can get blending of them. Yeah. There's divine command theory. There is virtue ethics, which is my own favorite personally. And virtue ethics is actually less concerned with moral decisions and actions in some systematic fashion, and more concerned with being the sort of person who can make correct moral judgments.
Yes.
And then you have Kantian deontology or transcendental ethics. Then you have utilitarianism, and then you have nihilism, the rejection. And there are nuanced niche differences and variations on these, but those are sort of the primary colors of moral philosophy. And every branch of those seems to have its advocates who say, and anyone who doesn't subscribe to our version doesn't believe in ethics at all. Sure. So, for example, Sam Harris went up in 2014, long before his supposed meltdown, and got on a stage in front of millions of people and said, now, morality has to do with moving people away from the worst possible world.
Okay.
And defined as the worst possible suffering for the most possible creatures. In other words, utilitarianism.
It's like an inverse utilitarianism, yeah.
And he says, and if you don't believe in my negative utilitarianism, if you don't believe that morality is identical with my negative utilitarianism, I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. Now, this is coming from someone with a master's degree in philosophy who has just said in public he has no idea what virtue ethics or deontology is.
Yes, and I made my statement earlier that we are making people less intelligent. Our education system and the kinds of systems that reward people who make public statements about how I don't know about what I am supposed to be the master of is like there is a and I'd even be wondering. I wonder how far it would be to go into a moral obligation for institutions in the form of revolution and reform to undergo change in order to do what they're supposed to do. But that's going to be a long. I think that road is a little ways down before we're going to be. I don't know if we're going to even be able to get to that tonight, or in this conversation.
Yeah.
No, I just broke OPSEC and told somebody that we were recording in the evening. Oh no. But the point on that one is it's because I can probably, I think the challenge that I have with Sam Harris is not that I cannot make, let's call it, condolences for errors in his judgment or mistakes, things that are made or disagreements that we have on subjects. It's really more like the character and the caricature of Sam Harris that is what is frustrating. And it's interesting because and why I find this interesting and where I'm going with this is that let's just talk about education in America. It's certainly a political talking point. It's certainly education's declining and reading rates are falling apart and whatever. People find their own things on it. But it what no one can really do, what not it's not that no one can really do, but the in between the in between the mudslinging of politics, there seems to be no, or a very difficult time identifying why education at all.
Yes.
Why education at all? Because the boomers sent their kids to school, or the boomers sent their kids to school because you get a degree so you can work a white collar job and get paid more. Basically, saying the value of education was monetary. And then you have old, like old medieval monk like belief systems that are the pursuit of knowledge is fundamentally the pursuit of God, because we are pursuing truth and we're pursuing the source of truth. And then there's the enlightenment of, like, humanistic outcomes that we can improve the world around us, and all of these kind of things, right? So, like,
Yeah. And the humanistic improve the world is, I think, largely a virtue signal in the jockeying for status among upper class white society.
are you talking about in that reference time of the Enlightenment or now?
I'm talking about now. I'm talking about an
Okay,
academic
okay,
culture now.
okay, yeah. Well, yeah, I think
It might have been back then too. But people didn't talk that way about changing the world. And
sure. So you know what I'm saying, like, and but now I want to go back in one more time to the claim of the subjectivity of knowledge and our access to objective truth, and where we are going to get with that, because I'm not. Sometimes I've tried to kind of read through a little bit of the argument before, and I want to hear, in its most distilled form, what are you claiming about reality and life? Because what we believe has consequences, and how we think about things as in issues.
Right.
And I'm curious as to what the claim is you're making, because I think I understand it, but it's complicated.
It is very complicated, and in a sense there's not only one claim, because there's so many things that are nested together. But one of the and it's a shame we haven't talked about this, because it's one of the defining features of the Enlightenment. Perhaps the defining feature of the Enlightenment is the destruction of myth, the demystification of the world. We want to end these things, and so much of postmodernism has just been the continuation of the Enlightenment, just with the addendum that the Enlightenment itself was also a myth. That's essentially the central thesis of Horkheimer and Adorno. As I said, we have to free ourselves from the myth of the Enlightenment. They've held on to the desire to end myth. But if you truly reject the Enlightenment, you also... my belief is that the aim of the Enlightenment, and Jonathan Rauch in Kindly Inquisitors, one of the most underrated liberal pro-Enlightenment books out there, I think says it best. The purpose of what he calls liberal science, science, liberal democracy, free markets, is to resolve conflicts without violence. The purpose of science is, how do we resolve disputes in belief about what is true without the proverbial gun to the head that you mentioned? And the purpose of free markets is, how do we allocate resources in that same way? And liberal democracy is, how do we allocate the direction that the guns are pointing, without turning them on each other? It's all about avoiding violence. It's all about avoiding conflict. And I think the path out of the Enlightenment begins with the acceptance of the reality of violence and conflict. You can't actually escape it. And the reason that postmodernism emerged at the time that it did, just namely in the mid-1940s, early 1950s, was because of the Second World War. The First World War was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. It was called the Great War, and it was supposed to be the last war. And then it was followed on the heels by another grand war of equal scale. And so all the people who had hope for and belief in the Age of Reason, that Enlightenment, the science, was going to be this candle in the dark that would end fear and hatred and bring us together and unify us, that was shattered. We had a brief little candle, an emerging flame return for a moment in the 1990s, when Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History and the Last Man. Said, actually, I think now we've reached the end of history. Bam! 9/11 happens. And then the counter hypothesis, which he was attempting to refute, the clash of civilizations hypothesis by his mentor Samuel Huntington, was proven right, I think. Most people in philosophy agree at this point. Not to appeal to consensus, I believe Samuel Huntington was right. Violence is inescapable. You can't escape conflict. And so the destruction of myth, the necessity of it, goes away. If
the necessity of myth goes away, or the necessity of the destruction of myth?
The necessity of the destruction of myth. Because the concern with Adorno and Horkheimer was that the Enlightenment would mythologize itself and need to eradicate itself. But all possible replacements for the Enlightenment would undergo the same process, was their concern. And it ended up being a very pessimistic book. And so the destruction of the postmodernism, of the postmodernists, is in a sense a continuation of the destructive tendency of the Enlightenment, the compulsion to destroy myth so that we have no cause to fight with each other. The pursuit of objectivity itself is the pursuit of the disinterested aloofness of a judge, so we can arbitrate disputes and find resolution without conflict. But if you go in with an acceptance of conflict and say, maybe that's not on the table, then myth is possible again. And we don't need to go down this Kantian pursuit of the noumena, which is, in his opinion, is not achievable, but we can at least find a priori truth. We can find beliefs that with certainty in a realm beyond the subjective experience. And we actually have a foundation for that in the school of philosophy called phenomenology. This was started by Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger and Gadamer. And, you know, there are people who will try to link Heidegger with the postmodernists, and I get why they're doing that. They're trying to defend the Enlightenment. They're trying to defend our society and so forth. But the case for trusting our subjective experience is basically that's kind of what we're stuck with anyways. And, you know, you don't get goodness or beauty if your standard is objectivity and truth, because objectivity is neutral and truth is something that we don't have access to and which seeks the destruction of what is incomplete or appears subjective, including myth. Have I made my case for subjectivity, or am I missing some completion in the circle there?
I understand the claim. I think I understand the claim better. There still seems to be one part that in my head is just kind of bouncing around like loose Lego bricks.
Mm-hmm.
So the ground of the claim itself, what you're saying, because I think I'm getting bogged down in the names and the Enlightenment and then the postmodern argument. But you're saying that it's not only do we not. I'm sorry. There's a part that I'm kind of struggling over, which has to do with the relationship between our subjective perspective and what is true, and why there is a sort of negative interaction there is kind of the. I mean, I know I'm just probably driving you mad with how simplistic I'm thinking about this. Because what I'm trying not to do is just give a counter narrative and like you told a story and I told a story, and I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to like better understand the argument. Now,
yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, would you point to, for example, optical illusions or things that we see with our own eyes that are deceptive, like the things in the world are not always as we see, and our senses do seem to be unreliable to some degree.
Mm-hmm. So, yes. So our senses are certainly unreliable. I mean, you also have hallucinogenic drugs that can,
Right.
but the other example is like dreams, right? You have a dream. You're experiencing a world that isn't there, right? But that is a different. So, like, there is a weight to the subjective, and perhaps what happens in the argument between the objective and the subjective is that they're made unofficial. They're artificially made enemies of one another. Is probably a way of saying it. That the objective and the subjective are pitted against each other, where the objective is the objective is cold and out there and undenying,
Yeah.
and cold out there and inaccessible. But what's inside is accessible and authentic, and so the subjective is prioritized over the objective for the sake of, in the simplest of terms, hedonism, and the most complex of terms, like, essentially, this is all, like, it's all we have.
Yeah, so it's tricky because there are many different senses that these words can be used in. So, like, objective can mean exists independent of my perception of it, what Kant would call the noumena.
Sure, A is A.
Yeah, and then there's but here we're back into mathematics and names and language, but then there's objective in the sense of, like, disinterested. And there's a few other senses you can use the term in, and there are multiple senses you can use the word subjective in. For example, subjectivism as the belief in the legitimacy of our subjective experiences in epistemological for the purpose of knowing things, is easily conflated with relativism.
Yes,
which is the belief that
very good
all subjective views are equally valid.
Correct.
Now, in my subjective experience, not all subjective views are equally valid. So is that subjective experience that I'm having that like this is more beautiful than that, or this sounds more correct than that, if my view that these two things are not equal is not equal with someone else, like, relativism can be self-defeating at it. I don't like that kind of argument, but
again, another
the point is simply that subjectivism and relativism are not inherently identical.
That's an important deal, because I don't think and again, friend, philosopher, person I knew made a really clean argument on it. He goes, "There's no such thing as a moral relativist. There's only moral skeptics." Like, because I mean he that was his challenge, in a sense of, like, you won't find somebody who's actually a moral relativist because they can't. It's not an achievable claim, but there is grounds for reasons that we are skeptical of our access to objective knowledge on morality. That would be fine. So, and so now when while I'm kind of tightening down on it, I think I want to make sure I'm going to do a bit of a social faux pas and take moral relativism and push it off to the side really forcefully, in saying that the primary feature, the primary identifying factor of moral relativism is malice and disdain. I think it's primarily malice and cynicism is what it is.
Well, and I think it's and I think that it's actually very important to point that out, because the way that people argue for moral relativism is not always, but very often, very transparent. Like, you can see the intent through the manipulation of the arguments very clearly. Yes. But the point that the greater point, and maybe this ties things together a little bit, is that actually all pursuit of truth and objectivity can be like that. There was a paper put out. I actually haven't read it. I've only heard references to it. I don't feel like I need to read it, but a couple of researchers put out, evolutionary psychologists argue that the origin of logic was not to find truth, but social status seeking in beating people in arguments and rationalizing existing positions. I mean,
I have 2 degrees in being pretentious, so yeah, we're great. I'm like, my life expectancy supports this argument wholeheartedly.
I don't think you need to study evolutionary psychology at all, or even to buy an evolutionary foundation for this theory to be like, yeah, I see that checks out. if you read a scientific paper, a good scientific paper, they almost never use the word true or truth. They'll say, we did this studies.
Okay.
This is what we saw. Mm-hmm. This is what these are some of the conclusions we think that could be drawn from this. And here's our like the weight we put on those conclusions. It's almost a joke. Every study says more research needs to be done on next study to, but it's very nuanced in describing what they see.
Why did you describe those papers as good?
Because they do not claim to possess more certainty than they have. And I would say,
so you're making a moral evaluation of there's a moral evaluation of the author.
Well, you could say moral. You could also say aesthetic, because I believe the foundations for the desirability of science themselves are aesthetic. It isn't a moral obligation for people to be a scientist.
No, it's not.
But there is an aesthetic draw to science in the virtues one develops through it. And when people claim to do science, but are not being good at following the aesthetic that motivates scientific undertakings, someone who is a scientist finds that repulsive. And morality is actually secondary. Calling it immoral is the introduction of that logical, I'm going to berate you and browbeat you to prove I'm right, to get you to stop doing this thing that I find distasteful. But the distaste actually precedes logic and precedes morality, perhaps. And so much, I think, of the desire to find objective morality is the desire to have ammunition to browbeat other people with. So if only we could have this thing where we could have enough power, linguistic power, to beat everybody into conformity, then we could all get along. We could all agree on these things. That's right is right, and so forth.
So, okay. Now that second part, I think, is a little bit more important as well. You see it in the way that people who do not believe themselves to be religious are very quick to use religious force are very quick to use government force to enforce their religious beliefs. Multiculturalism is a good example. It's the only way that it's achievable is by turning all forms of belief into fashion statements that have no meaningful correlation to one's life. Your belief is nothing but your aesthetic. I am a multiculturalist first, and then a Christian in aesthetic. So I wear a frock, but that guy wears a monk robe, and that guy wears a thing. It's all purely aesthetic, arbitrarily aesthetic. So,
well, you can describe what we're calling virtue signaling in terms of aesthetics or in terms of morality. It's conventionally called virtue signaling. Virtue is a word that's associated with morality, not aesthetics. But you can describe it as aesthetics. But when I'm talking about aesthetics, I mean it hits us subjectively. It doesn't go through a sort of mental algorithm of evaluating the duties they have fulfilled or not fulfilled in some kind of deontological fashion. You don't need Kant's categorical imperative to see some sociopath tell a lie and be like, after doing some calculations, I think that is wrong. It is much more direct and I think honest to say with Achilles, it is more hateful than hell itself to hear someone have one thing in their heart and to say something else. It is sufficient to say it is aesthetically displeasing. It is disgusting, even. In fact, our disgust neurology is very closely related to morality if the research by David Pizarro is to be believed.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Christian concept of common grace? Or general revelation?
Possibly by another name.
General revelation is another one that might be.
Is that the idea that the presence of God is made known through creation and is available to all, not just to those who are directly proselytized to? Or am I confusing concepts?
You're getting, no, you're kind of nailing it down. Yeah, that's a good
Okay.
one. Or like, so there's a sort of different series of intellectual challenges that Christianity has to deal with when it comes to morality, culpability, salvation, sin, whatsoever, right? The knowledge of, like, it's, of course, contemporary American Christians oftentimes like to, or not even contemporary, but like the Christianity that a lot of us grew up in was a lot about belief, like accepting Jesus into your heart and using these kinds of words. Like, you need to, like, not only rationally believe that he is real, but also that he is real, but also then you have to put your faith in him, which is not very well explained in some cases outside of an emotional experience. But I'm not here to drag the church, because, that's not the point. But the idea of common grace, or even like the idea of the conscience, is that there is that we understand evil because we are created in the image of God, and because by being created in the image of God, we understand we have a diminished, due to noetic effects of sin and some other things, ability to perceive these things for what they are. Irony being tree of knowledge of good and evil, and we bungled that up. But
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm making this really convoluted and complicated.
No, you're going into a very interesting domain, which C.S. Lewis opened Mere Christianity with.
Yes, he does.
And
C.S. Lewis does a very C.S. Lewis style approach to the argument. Yes.
Well, it's interesting to think about C.S. Lewis's introduction there in the context of what we were just talking about with objectivity and logic, because C.S. Lewis concludes from the fact that everybody acts as if they believe in objective morality because they appeal to it in arguments.
Everyone acts as if they believe in some form of morality, yes.
Well, but if our understanding of this employment of objectivity in the context of truth in the history of the Enlightenment as a means to avoid conflict and to resolve conflict, to resolve the blood feud, is like truth is a means to the end of peace, then the fact that people make appeal to objective systems is not actually evidence that we all believe in truth, any more than like people who, when being attacked by a dog, reach for a stick, like they demonstrate a belief that the stick is intrinsically a weapon. It's like, well, no, it was just a tool of utility at the time in the context. And the fact that people might reach for an argument for moral objectivity in order to try to get their way in a social context doesn't actually imply a shared unified belief in this thing, only in a shared utility in the concept.
The ability to claim that something is true carries with it a certain moral weight.
Yes, it does.
That some people wish to wield the weight of the truth for immoral means.
Yes, or perceived moral beliefs.
Yeah.
Or moral means.
Yeah. So like that. That is clear that people will lie because they want to have there is no simple, direct explanation as to why truth is relevant to us.
Right. The people will talk in philosophical nerd circles about, for example, a difference between a coherence theory of truth, which is kind of like a mathematical model, or a correspondence theory of truth, which is like descriptive. But if you think about the correspondence theory of truth, the word truth is not actually necessary at all. You can just say, does what someone is describing correspond with what I'm seeing? And talking about it in terms of appearances is just fine. Where the word truth really begins to have utility is when you're describing a statement that someone else has said. So truth does not describe the world. Truth describes language. But you get very, very early in the history of Western philosophy, all the way back to Parmenides, it begins to slip from a description of language, description of someone's statement? Did they testify to the truth? Did they testify? Was their testimony true? Is the better way of putting it. But like into the truth with a capital T as a reference to objective reality itself. And that's where the concept sort of gets away from us, and we begin to mystify ourselves with language. And that's why I think people like Hamann and Wittgenstein are so valuable. There's a great quote from Wittgenstein where he says, basically, philosophy is the perpetual battle against the mystification of language.
I think you said that earlier. I think you might have said that earlier. So where I think I'm coming at it, I struggle in the sense of the argument because I have basically a very different worldview, is probably how short it is. Of course, this is coming from the position of a Christian, but and I want to be able to kind of muddle on these things for a while, but the challenges that I run into, so like, it's interesting when you wrote the piece and I read it and I talked to you and now we've been talking about it is...
Are you talking about the science piece?
No, about the subjectivity of language having an influence
yes. With
know,
rape and consent and so forth.
Well, I mean, I think rape and between those two arguments, the consent one was much better. In my just, this is me just saying it. I mean that as like a compliment. Like, I liked that one. I found it much more easy to read. Much more not easy, but like I think I found the argument much more compelling as well. In that you engaged in, but it was also like twice as long. So whatever, right?
Yeah.
But whereas the first one you said, whereas the first one having to do with rape is kind of, I don't know. It's a little bit. I'm not finding it as convincing.
For the sake of whoever might have been listening to us for a full 2 hours and sticking with us, the argument comes from Dr. William Lane Craig, of all people, and he's made this argument in a number of different cases, very famously against Christopher Hitchens, and he was making an intuitive case for the existence of objective moral values, and by appeal to rape, and saying rape is really wrong. And it's not just our opinion that rape is wrong. It's actually wrong at a level that transcends our mere opinion.
Okay.
And the point I was trying to make in my response in this short little blog post is that what he's calling rape, we know rape is really wrong. The difference between rape and sex is essentially, and I could probably have been more precise in my language here, but rape is essentially sex that is wrong by definition. Now, there's a lot more connotation to rape about the use of force and consent and some other things like that. So saying rape is sex that is wrong is maybe not as precise as it could be.
Well, but it is murder that is killing that is wrong.
Exactly. Murder might be a better example, because murder is killing that is wrong by definition. Whereas killing includes things like war fighting or self-defense or the execution of a criminal. In certain cases, an executioner is not a murderer. Yes. Like that would be like incorrect use of the word. And so appealing to words that are wrong by definition as evidence that some things are wrong objectively is that mystification of language that Wittgenstein was warning us about.
Gotcha. Okay. That helps out a bunch more. That helps out a bunch more in clarifying the argument. And so so if I can kind of start to summarize a little bit of this in my own words, is that it's like I guess I'm still it's just the questions of objectivity that are rough on my end, but you're criticizing, you're saying that there's something inappropriate about the mystification of language, which is accomplished by using circular definitions in words to argue for the existence of themselves or a thing. Kind of that way. We're like,
I mean, tautologies are tautological, but I
Sure.
guess what I'm trying to argue against, I'll put it this way. Let me go back in history a little bit. The Enlightenment started with Descartes. David Hume, with his guillotine, his is ought gap, and a few other things. He was a very broad skeptic generally, really put it on the ropes. Really put the project of the Enlightenment on the ropes. People were were becoming pessimistic about the possibility of saving reason, and the possibility of reason bringing us true knowledge. And who should come to the rescue but Immanuel Kant? And Kant brings us what can be called transcendental logic. And the whole point of transcendental logic, which he presents in his critique of pure reason, which should really be called his analysis of pure reason, but he gives his reasons for calling it a critique, is that we can know things with certainty apart from experience. We can know things, and the best example of this actually comes before Kant. It comes from Descartes, who said we can know, for example, that a triangle has interior angles that add up to 180 degrees. And we know this without, we can know this without testing it. But the interior angles of a triangle adding up to 180 degrees is not a part of the definition of a triangle. A triangle is just 3 points in space. So we can learn something by analysis, by thinking really hard about a thing prior to experience.
Yes.
Now, a lot gets worked into that. And so what Kant did with his creation of transcendental logic, and many things have followed from that, including the categorical imperative and some other things, was he was saving the possibility of reason. He was saving the dignity of reason and hope in the salvific power of reason to unify us. But as we talked about before with Haman, you can't have thoughts without language. And language comes from experience. The whole possibility of a priori knowledge and of reason apart from experience is contingent on language that also comes from experience, and which can only be applied based on common experience anyways, based on the idea that your understanding of the word cat is similar to my understanding of the word cat. We're not talking about neko like we're Japanese or something. And so the problem of language interrupts that hope in the salvific power of reason. And so I guess my point, my argument is that this pursuit of objectivity and certainty is a fool's errand that we are in pursuit of in order to browbeat other people into submission. Why are we trying to do that? I don't need to force you to accept my conclusion if we are both coming into an argument with a shared spirit, with a spirit of curiosity. And so, and if we don't have that shared spirit of curiosity, no amount of browbeating is going to do it anyways. Since when was someone persuaded against their own will by logic? That doesn't happen.
Okay.
Not so my experience anyways.
So there's just a heavy case of the demystification that you're looking for, and that I mean, yeah. So that I find it respectful. So I appreciate that. I think where I will certainly have issues, challenges are come down to maybe a loose critique of it. I think it kind of ends up in a bit of a nihilistic end.
It ends in nihilism if you presuppose that meaning must be grounded in objectivity. If you assume that subjective preferences are insufficient and that the subjective appreciation of myth is insufficient.
How does that, we're going to have to get completely into epistemology to make that work, because it would depend on how you define and how you understand the legitimacy of a belief being in something. Because,
let me give a mundane example. Suppose I have two dishes in front of me. One is hardtack and water, and the other one is like a Wagyu steak.
Yeah, really nice food. Yeah.
Yeah. And now, can I prove beyond all shadows of all doubts that the steak is better food than the hardtack? Do I, and then here's the other way of asking, here's a separate question that's maybe more important. Do I need to prove beyond all shadows of all doubt that the Wagyu steak is better than the hardtack? Or is my preference sufficient to justify choosing the Wagyu over the hardtack?
It would be in this case, because you're presupposing it, that the decision between hardtack and the steak have no moral consequences. You are approaching that question from a framework that there is no moral obligation between the two.
What's the difference between a moral decision and a decision like this in terms of the knowledge necessary to make such a decision?
The knowledge necessary?
Like what distinguishes moral decisions from other kinds of decisions?
You cannot do moral things for immoral reasons. You cannot do it on the basis of ignorance. You cannot accomplish you cannot to make a moral claim.
That would be Kant's argument, because he says his deontological claim is that the nature of morality itself requires basically the
intent of the actor.
Yeah, but I mean, how did he get there? He got to that position by analyzing the nature of morality itself. In other words, by using the language in order to try to distill the essence of morality and then work out how we should act from language.
Yes,
but that's not how good judgments work in any other context.
We used the subjectivity of language to observe. He used the subjectivity of language to observe morality in order to come to arguments about the objective nature of morality.
Well, he wasn't observing. The whole point was to arrive at what the necessity of what morality must be a priori, prior to experience, so prior to any kind of observation. He said, what must morality be in order to be itself? Now, if you are trying to make a good decision, because how to treat someone, basically any question of judgment can be moralized. You can moralize how you should treat your spouse. You could moralize how to treat your kids, how a school should teach its students. You can moralize anything.
I mean,
but it all comes
very
down
simply
to
goes back to Hume's guillotine on that one. Very simply, like in every decision that you're going to have a contextual argument and an ought. Yeah. Otherwise, you're not making a decision. And so there's an ought involved, and the question is, where does that ought come from?
Sure. And here I will defer to my boy Matthew Crawford again, who says that at a certain level, the line between morality and competence actually breaks down and they blur together. And morality is actually nothing more than, to the degree that morality is, I think, a very useful thing to talk about, nothing more than a certain kind of competence in how to treat other people and how to treat yourself and how to live well. Which is, you can see my inner virtue ethicist coming out here.
Yeah. No, I see a little bit of the virtue ethics. The question is, like, what does that mean to what is even the thing of treating somebody well? Where does that come from? Because that
comes from experience.
Why is that experience to be genuinely trusted?
Well, it's not to be trusted completely, but how do we check it with more experience? That's all we have,
and that's the claim. Is that that's all we have, and so like a simple disagreement of the claim would be, no, we don't. We have the Bible, right? Or we have this is not a convincing argument by any means. It's not going to be. It's not going to come back as like a convincing argument in the sense of rhetoric, but then it would be disproved if we had access to divine revelation. That would be a flat refusal of it. Okay.
I would say so, yeah. If we had... Now, here it becomes a question, though. How do you know that you've had access to divine revelation? I used to listen to a lot of pastors on the radio. I still do sometimes, but I haven't in a while. And I remember one call in which a pastor was speaking with a couple whose son had died, and they were praying about it. They were still suffering about it. And at one point, they began to hear their dead son voice. Their dead son visited them in dreams and stuff. And the pastor said, "That is not your son. Do not listen to that voice." But the same can be said of the voice of God. You know, how do you know the voice in your head is divine revelation? There was a pastor named Dan Barker who wrote a book called Godless. This preceded the God Delusion, I think. He was a pastor who became an atheist. And he described, I wrote about this in my book on Christianity, Holy Nihilism, how he heard the voice of God tell him to go for a drive. And so he did. He got in his car and he drove. And the voice in his head, which he thought was God, said, "Go down this road." And so he did. He says, "Now park here." And he parked in the cul-de-sac and waited. And the voice disappeared. He didn't hear anything again. And he sat there for 3 hours. And he finally realized, I don't think that was God at all. I think that was just a weird voice in my head telling me things. And I believed it because I had been primed to believe that voices like this were God. So the distrust in our senses also like cuts in many different directions at the same time, including our access to divine revelation, or the modern version of divine revelation, to big data and algorithms and mathematical systems that seem to provide us with objective truth. Oh, we have statistics about this. Oh, do you know? This is divine revelation from computers. They're not the things that they think you are there, and they are as dependent upon subjective inputs as our own bodies are. You don't escape the problem of subjectivity. And so at the end of the day, like I was saying before, we can't reach the noumena, as Kant says. But the only reason we would want to reach the noumena is this desire to end conflict from an objective third party, breaking us apart. We want to browbeat other people into submission, into some kind of unified whole. And we just don't have to do that. And I think it's better. The conversations are better. The debates, the dialogues, the learning and the science are better without that as a kind of Damoclesian obligation over our heads.
Sure. Do you think the implication that access to objective knowledge is really born out of desire to browbeat others? Is that just? Do you think that assertion is just might be a little overstated? Because there are people believe things for different reasons. I mean, you have the famous problem of like Socrates. If people knew the right things, they would do the right things. Turns out that's very wrong. That's not true at all. People will look exactly at what is good and say, "I hate that. I want to destroy it." That. And now I don't. This is not going to be like this is not going to be a browbeating argument from existence or experience or whatever. But the idea that maybe I'll put it this way, is that like the argument that Socrates would, or it's not Socrates, was it Plato? The idea, if people knew the right things, they would do the right things. If they knew what was true, they would do what was true, is fundamentally refuted, or is not fundamentally, is refuted categorically by mankind's actions, because mankind will know what is right to do, but still do something else.
Yeah, there might be Aristotle.
Aristotle?
It might be Plato. I don't remember, because I know Aristotle had a term for the condition, and I don't remember what it is, for the condition of someone who knows the right thing to do, but doesn't do it. Mm-hmm. A person who procrastinates on their homework, who knows that they should be going to bed at the right time, but stays up late anyways. They do that revenge
No,
procrastination.
and those
And
are
I
those
forget
like
what that's called.
yeah, those cases are pretty simplified, and
Mhm.
I'm looking at the clock and realizing that we need to be careful on time here. So those things are pretty simplified. I mean, I'll just use an example. I have encountered people who look at that which is good, and their only desire in their existence is to kill it, and they know it is good, and they want to kill it because it is good.
What would an example of that be?
Let's see. What are some just really good? I mean, really easy examples. Perhaps are going to be things that I've seen in war. Things that I saw happen in Minneapolis. The idea of like even child, like if you've ever encountered people who are kind of into that whole pedophilia thing, where like they want to destroy the innocence of a child. Another example. This is kind of like a personal one, but it's actually really just short and down to earth. Is that when I had joined the military, I didn't do certain things that were described as immoral, and people who did those immoral things wanted me to also do them with them, so that misery loves its company kind of thing.
Yeah.
And those are all very. I mean, some of them are petty, and some of them are more grandiose. But you look at here's a recent story.
So like the Fight Club line, I wanted to destroy something beautiful.
Well, no, I mean here's a really good example of a contemporary issue that might be somewhat apocryphal, but I just discovered that there is a person in California who was born as a man who wants to. He was born with male genitalia, whatever. We're gonna just kind of skip the thing. Who desires to have a uterus implanted into his body artificially by science so that he can become pregnant and then get an abortion. The only purpose that person is going through all the right, so they want to create life and then destroy it, right?
They're a real life, a living philosophy experiment in
Right.
the concepts of gender right there.
Okay, there are people that participate in forms of human trafficking, and there are people who commit so let me be very clear in this one.
Let me
Talk about or I'll even talk about myself in like an event where it's like I know it is not the right thing to do the thing, but I'm still going to do it anyway.
Well, let me bring up our good friend Justin O. Schmidt as a counterexample, because I would argue, not on objective grounds but subjective grounds, that being stung by an insect is bad.
It's painful,
and being stung by a tarantula hawk or a bullet ant is particularly bad. But he did it anyways. Why did he do it anyways?
Why is being stung bad? Again, it's the
Because
same thing.
Hurts.
Yeah, but that's painful. That's not good or bad. Sometimes good is painful, and sometimes bad is not. This is a very old argument. I mean,
so okay, fair. So here's the follow-up question then. What then does what is objective have to do with what is good? What is the connection between objectivity and good? Aren't those two conceptually opposed?
It depends on how you identify the good defines what you worship. What do you
Isn't that a fancy way of saying that good is subjective?
No, I'm saying that what people's subjectivity, people are applying the idea of their own subjectivity to something that is objective, and effectively they are lying to themselves about what they think is true, because they're believing that because they cannot see it, it cannot exist. It's effectively the hide and go seek game. It's very simple. I think maybe I'm a little bit more critical. Maybe I'm being a little bit more short-sighted and critical, but like we as human beings come into a painful experience understanding that we do not have objective vision and therefore deny objectivity its existence.
So the most famous problem and the most obnoxious problem in moral philosophy is the trolley problem, right? Do you believe that the you can push someone off an overpass to save 5 people? If the trolley's coming, you push the fat man off, it stops the trolley and stops it from running over the 5 people who you see on the track. Do you believe there is an objective answer to that question? And you can even say, I think there is an objective answer, but I don't know what it would be. Perhaps there is an objective answer, but I don't have access to it.
I would lean towards that one. Is that there is an objective answer, and
I don't.
Part of the problem with the trolley, part of the issue with the trolley problem is that there's no amount of context that you could add to make sense of it, because the purpose of the context added is only to make it more convoluted. Like,
Right,
for
and
example,
to shift around the way most people will answer it. But
yeah.
the
But
point is, I don't think there is an objective answer, and
okay.
I think what the trolley problem illustrates
Hmm.
is exactly that a lot of our moral intuitions
Hmm.
and our feelings about these things
Yes.
are not objective. They are amalgamations of lots of different rules that emerge from different places.
Yeah.
Perhaps a good analogy is consciousness itself. Daniel Dennett has famously argued, and I think he's correct about this. I used to think he was silly, and then I got older. That consciousness is a bag of tricks. It's not one entity. It's not a separate kind of existence than physical matter. It's a composite of many different sensations that create an experience that is greater than the sum of its parts.
Okay.
And I think what we are calling morality,
Hmm.
as if it is one thing,
Hmm.
is in fact a similar kind of amalgamations of lots of lesser duties and competencies and aesthetics, and they blend together
Sure.
into an ethos
Hmm.
that a person may or may not share. Now, do you think you're a soldier and a fairly accomplished one? Do you think it is an obligation for a soldier to kill himself rather than be captured by the enemy?
My grandfather was a POW for 3 years in Korea.
Yeah,
So
I
like
don't.
it's just an interesting. It's a timing question.
Yeah,
N-
I don't
con-
think it is.
I don't.
But if I was a samurai, I would say it was
Yes, but why did the samurai think that way? That's the question.
because of the myths and the stories and the values that inspired their culture.
Okay.
And there's
Yes.
no
Honor.
objective foundation for those myths, for those ideals, and there doesn't have to be.
So, not saying there doesn't have to be for it to be significant to a person is a very different claim than saying that there are no. And I
That's true. That's a
and
very
I,
good point.
that's where I think that's where I'm. I
Yeah.
think that's where I'm at. Like I know in it's sort of in like in a worldview how I disagree with you. What I've been trying to do
Mhm.
in this part of our conversation is, and this is kind of this really goes back down to it, and this is why I wanted to have you on the show, and this is why I wanted to have this conversation with you, is because almost not a pathological, but in like I had become tired of not having a good intellect. Not that's there's no way I can say that without making it sound rude or destructive to like everybody else that I know. But that's not the point. It's that you are engaging in a material that I disagree. Came to a conclusion that I disagreed with, but I didn't know how to get to my disagreement without just giving an alternative theory.
Sure.
And that's probably it. And so I think where I'm starting to come to is, so you have a series of definitions that are difficult, but they have to do with like consciousness and subjectivity and language and knowledge and information. And although it's not exactly the most emotionally satisfying argument, I think that it holds in some pretty solid way. And one of
It
them is that
is very emotionally unsatisfying to many people
no,
because it's not neat and tidy
I'm
in
not
the way that
talking.
math is.
I'm not talking about your argument. I'm talking about my
Oh, sorry,
response. I think your. I think
sorry.
your. I actually think your argument has some compelling factor to it. Where I think where it looks like it I have a grounds for disagreement is on the assumption of intelligence itself, that our ability to have a self, an identity of the self, and consciousness implies in sort of the watchmaker argument that in order for you to have both identity and intelligence, those two things don't come ex nihilo unless they're created by something. And so in order to have the ability to engage in order to have intelligence in the sense to engage in the subjectivity and observe the differences between a subjective perspective of a thing and that it is different than what it actually is, implies that you have something that cannot be accounted for by rationalism or materialism or even whatever, and then whatever it is that by definition is the source and object of that is simultaneously then the source of morality itself. And that's essentially the argument, is that the
So is this
existence.
another transcendental argument? based
No,
on what would be necessary for a thing that the thing that we're doing presupposes.
the existence of intelligent life implies intelligent design. It requires it, and so then and
Why is
whatever,
that?
because things that do not are because something does not create something that it is different. Like, how do I put this another way? How do I put this another way? Um it's one of the fundamental arguments against a naturalistic worldview, and that's what I would say there. But it's that the existence of intelligence in in beings implies intelligent design,
Mm.
because the ability, or I'm sorry, it depends on intelligent design, because if there is not intelligent design, then what this thing that you're experiencing called intelligence is just a deterministic outlook, or it's just biological determinism to
Yeah.
produce something that has no implication in itself. So
This is why, and I'll take one more opportunity to advertise the essay, because I'm sure I explain it better in the book than I
fair.
can off the cuff here. But this is why I think it's so important to bring up the mathematics thing that we were going over before, because
Yes.
what the intelligent design argument you're making here, it's like Sound of Music. Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could. Like that. Is essentially applying a mathematical principle kind of approach to relating to the world, and saying, well, Newtonian physics, nothing can come into motion without being moved. Where's the first mover? Aquinas.
Sure. Yep.
Where's that? And it is
Or
applying that
Avicenna and
to a complex world, and saying, well, where can we find certainty in the things? I think it is perfectly acceptable to say we don't know. We don't know how the first species came into being, and we can know that evolution explains how species can change over time, while at the same time not explaining the origin of life.
Fair.
Evolution does not necessarily give us abiogenesis. That could be a mystery. How did matter come into being itself?
Sure. Yeah.
Now, this is a classic counter argument that, if God created the universe, then who created God? And we get into this kind of infinite regress of turtles all the way down. And if God didn't need a creator, then why did the universe need a creator? And so on and so forth. But I think the bigger point and the more important point is, and the more radical point is that these mathematical principles we're using, not just you can't get intelligent life without intelligent design. I mean, even the law of identity is not nearly as useful and as predictive as people think it is. It is useful in winning arguments, because if you can define your position in terms of, well, I think A is equal to A, and if you disagree with me, you think A is not equal to A, that looks pretty silly to everyone. Am I right? Am I right? To the audience around you. And you can humiliate people and you can embarrass them. But the world is a lot more like Heraclitus's river, where there are, which is not to say that there aren't patterns. It's not to say that we can't learn things and operate in the world. But as soon as we try to translate the things we've learned about the world and how we adapt our behavior in the world in a pragmatic fashion into words, it loses its texture and tone and meaning. I mean, you've spent time online, you hear these red pill guys, right, talk about the way you got to treat women, what women's psychology is really like. And many of those guys are correct in their descriptions, juxtaposed with the kind of collegiate, polite society interpretation of what gender psychology is like. But as soon as that wisdom hits some 22-year-old kid who's never been on a date, and now thinks, because he's heard the revelations of a 35-year-old guy who's been through 2 marriages and 1 divorce and 3 kids, thinks he knows what women is like. No, he doesn't.
Yeah.
He doesn't know anything because he heard the words of a guy who learned some stuff by his life.
Sure.
And again, this is not to say that you can't learn from listening to others. You certainly can. And a lot of that learning is in priming you to see things that turn it into what you might call body knowledge as opposed to abstract knowledge. Knowledge where if you hear a loud bang, you hit the floor and then think, instead of wondering, was that a gunshot? Yes, that was a gun. Anyways, a digression. So the point is really more about the scale of what can be deduced in grand sense from analyzing the words themselves and the concepts through the words in language alone. It's an argument against Kantian deontology, essentially.
Okay. So
or transcendentalism.
Then, like, and maybe a more casual question would be: then, do you think that the observation of the subjectivity of language ends up throwing out the baby with the bathwater, saying that, well, because we don't have access to objective information, therefore everything must be subjective, and it's easier to work with that way? Or is does that make sense? Because, like,
It depends on what you think the baby is.
Fair enough. I mean, ontology. I'm sorry. Objectivity is the baby in this sense, especially moral objectivity. Like, we don't have access to moral objectivity because we are inherently subjective through language. Therefore, moral objectivity doesn't matter.
I think objectivity is the bathwater. I think if what you're looking for is a code, a shared sense of what is the right way to act in relationship to each other, I don't think you need the concept of objectivity to get that. And I think objectivity is actually a worse tool for accomplishing that shared sense of what is right than myths and stories and conversations like these.
So why is there an implication that we get along? Like, I
didn't mean to imply that.
Okay. Like, why is I was just going to say, like, I'm kind of, so maybe not in a bit of a utilitarian sense, like, appealing to moral objectivity is not effective at producing consent in this sense.
I mean, it can be a useful tool for persuasion. It's the necessary tool for legitimizing legal and civic infrastructure that uses violence to control people. Like, the legitimacy of our court system is built on an illusion of objectivity, and it works by the maintenance of that illusion. It's magic in the literal sense of the term.
I think it's on stolen. I think it's basically living on stolen. Our legal system is living on stolen, or probably more appropriately said, pillaged legitimacy.
I mean,
in the sense
the
that
illusion was created 2,600 years ago. Okay. I'm plot spoiling too much. Jack will get mad at me, but
okay.
Well, you can read all about it in Aeschylus in the essay. But essentially, I think objectivity from the very get-go, long before postmodernism, long before all of this, was an illusion. We could call it I called it in one video. Someone had emailed me with a question about Christianity and civilization, and is it necessary for it? And I said, basically, to work, civilization has to have a civilizational formula. And Christianity actually is a civilizational formula. It's not the only civilizational formula, but it does help facilitate that. It gives an answer to the blood feud. It gives a path of reconciling conflict between people without bloodshed, in its emphasis on forgiveness and other things of that nature, the redirection of focus and attention from present world conflicts to the hereafter. But there are other formulas for doing that. China seemed to manage civilization just fine, long before Christendom, in fact, and Egypt did too, although there are some questions about what their religion was like and how different it might have been.
But what those answers don't provide is why civilization at all.
Exactly. No, it
And
doesn't.
that's yeah,
Yeah.
and that's I think that's where and that's where I go back to the stolen arguments land is that you're basically not you. I'm not accusing you of this. I'm saying the argument that of asking what is the utility in Christianity and civilization building is that it's sort of putting the cart before the horse, or it's building it out of building in a carpentry sense, building a home without acknowledging the existence of trees. You're like, you know,
Yeah, and I will say, and this is where I get hung up with Christianity,
mm-hmm.
is there has been a huge resurgence in interest in Christianity in the last 5 years, I would
Yep,
say.
yep,
And the thing that annoys me about it is that it's very reactionary. It's very earth oriented, and it says if only we could return to Christianity as a culture, we could save our civilization. We could
okay,
get the earthly ends that we desire
mm-hmm.
by pursuing this religion as a means to these earthly ends.
Yeah.
And
So
that's not how you do Christianity. That's like doing science so you can persuade people. That's not how good science works.
yes, I can share in your criticism. I'll let you know it's been around a lot longer than the last 5 years, and for where I sit in my little ivory tower, maybe those aren't the right people to be surrounding yourself with. In that, I'm not telling you how to like pick your friends. It's that there is a certain. I think of it as like let's come from within the gun culture. It's just a really easy example. So I grew up. I was in Ranger Battalion a long time ago. I've been out of the military for a long time. I was in Ranger Battalion a long time ago at a time where the cultural milieu of the environment was not very Christian. In fact, there were certain elements of it which were completely opposed to religion. They were very deep. It was like the popular common group thing was the Sam Harris type of new atheism. Very, it's
Interesting.
in aesthetic, in mentality, in in sort of the cynicism that it provided for people who were in going onto the battlefield. But now let me add some more context to this. And so, in the last 10 years, I've been around the world. I've been around different parts of the gun industry and the firearms culture, and I've witnessed people who have sort of marketed themselves as a gun person, but then use that as a delivery mechanism to kind of sneak in their Christianity. And it's just
Whoever
real.
could you be talking about?
And there's I don't. I mean,
I'm kidding. You don't need to answer that.
I'm not going to be actually. I don't have a person in mind because I've seen it happen so many times that I'm not really thinking of individual people in this case.
Okay.
And there's another example of this that happened when I was younger, when I was a child, and there was a church that we attended for a while that every summer would put on a motorcycle Sunday. And it was this huge event that they put on. Or we saw it just happen recently with like Super Bowl Sunday themed church events. And all of these elements within what we're calling American or even Western Christianity, we find fundamentally distasteful for a couple of reasons. But one of them is because it comes across as very dishonest.
Yeah,
And
this got a
because
hucksterish quality.
a huckster, I am using the marketing of, oh, hey, you like football? I like football too. Come be a Christian with me. And you're like, that's not how this works. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
our the huckster marketing mentality of the American experience has invaded even our belief systems or the
Yeah.
traveling salesman or the whatever.
Well,
But the
not to sound hucksterish,
Mhm,
but to myself, but
mhm,
to borrow from some Christian language.
mhm,
There is a passage in which Jesus is admonishing his followers: don't swear oaths. It says, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. You don't
mhm,
need to make a big deal about, oh, I swear on my mother's tomb and all this stuff.
mhm.
I think Christianity in general would be a lot more attractive, probably less attractive to a lot of people, honestly, but more attractive to people like me and probably like you if it were more direct like that, if it were less gaudy and it's showy stuff. But I think this ties back to the whole desire for objectivity and truth and so forth too. The things that we want to present as true would have a lot less of that "the lady doth protest too much, methinks" quality to them if we just said, it appears to me to be this way. The appeal to objectivity and to truth feels like a sin of supererogation. It's too strenuous. It's over the top. Just as the desire to make Christianity cool, or to push anything that you want to do as being cool, is risks corrupting the thing. My personal theory, not to psychoanalyze someone I don't know at all personally, but my own theory about Ryan Holiday is that he actually had a guilty conscience for being a manipulative marketer by his self-description, by his own admission, and wanted to use his skills to share good, to spread good in the world. And so he's like, I spread lies and nonsense, bullshit, to go back to 2.5 hours ago. So I'm going to spread good stuff. But the problem was not necessarily in what he was spreading. The problem was in how he was spreading it. And the very medium of his dissemination corrupted this thing called Stoicism. And there is some good stuff in Marcus Aurelius. You just won't find much of it, or the spirit of it, in The Obstacle is the Way, or Stillness is Key, or whatever his other books are. Those are the only two I've read.
Ego is the enemy.
Yeah. Like the desire to make things cool has a corrupting effect. Like the Ring of Power in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Is what we're talking about.
I think yes. The challenge then that I have to present is that you're a philosopher, and so you're trying to deal with things that are true or right or good, and you're engaging in these. I would believe these things, right?
I'm curious about the world, and
Yes.
I like to find things out, and I want to live a good life. And I hate. I'm coming to hate. I've come to hate more in the last years appeals to etymology, because they're often very unhelpful. But in this case, I think it's useful. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. It's the philosophia. It's the love of wisdom. And, this can be practical. This can be like, I love my life. I'm married with kids. I have a modest house, but a good house. I have a job that I like. I don't make a ton of money, but electrician is pretty good. I hang around with construction guys when I'm at work. Construction comes in cycles with, work and so forth. But and the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of what is fun and it's interesting, but it is also elusive. And I think expanding our notion of philosophy from the pursuit of truth, which can be sort of presuming the thing that has to be proved in this case, which is hopefully what philosophers try to avoid in some cases, often comes down to a question of the utility and the use of words. And I can't think of any better way of putting it than, and perhaps this is a place to conclude this almost 3-hour conversation.
I know. I haven't had a 3-hour in a long time, and I was already kind of exhausted and kind of burnt out from the day.
If it makes you feel any better, I didn't sleep very well last night, so we pushed through. But I can't think of a better way to put it than Lao Tzu did, the beginning of the Tao, where he says, the way which can be spoken is not the true and eternal way. We are on a treadmill of constantly trying to find new words and appropriate words, less stagnant words for things which we could, without irony, describe as eternal truths, or as Rudyard Kipling would call them, the gods of the copybook headings. But without deceiving ourselves with the word truth and thinking that we know something we don't know, without becoming Job's friends, thinking we've discovered axioms of mathematics, so we know the nature of God. We have our experience, and that's actually more than enough, not just to live a good life, but to have interesting and informative conversations, to explore things, to learn about things beyond just the relative pain of insects, and to connect with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think I have really appreciated this conversation, and I know it's not going to come out. It's not going to. I don't think it's ending with any sort of big bang and gotcha. And I wanted to do that. I know that I didn't really say that too much in the beginning, but due to the nature of how conversations like this tend to go, people who are listening might still enjoy the topic for the same reasons why that you and I do, because we actually have general moral investment and concern for the ideas, but also in that sense, like I the way that we talk about things of this level of meaning oftentimes turn into gotchas and like traps and snack that kind of stuff, and I wanted to make sure I wanted to kind of extend an olive branch of good faith in that sense of like, even though I don't think one was really necessary, to have you explain this idea and how you were working through it in a way that I wasn't immediately just misconstruing as a fancy version of subjectivism or relativism. Sorry, moral relativism. So perhaps though you might have undone yourself in the end there because of the treadmill piece. Is that the existence of the treadmill presupposes the process of walking on it, and we're trying to use language as it perpetually changes through time to understand something, but while language isn't access to truth, we are still implying that something is there, and we are trying to use words that change over time to find access to a thing that may permanently be outside of our reach, at least for our knowable experience.
It may be outside of reach, or may not. The point is, it's difficult to convey or to perceive, or maybe we're just illustrating the limitations of metaphors, which are the mechanism of language. But let me share the exchange of olive branches, and don't be afraid to be patient in plotting some kind of counterpoint and building up to one, because what I wrote began as this kind of plotted counterpoint against our good friend Jay Dyer's transcendental argument for God. So inspiration can come from all places. So I will say, for people who are looking for some kind of knockdown argument against my position, there's a possible lead. I mentioned Joseph de Maistre some time ago. He has a book called The Generative Principle of Political Constitutions. And in this book, if you can find it in English and not in French, he describes a distinction between the written word and the spoken word, and how problems of language with the written word might not apply to the spoken word in the same way. And so the logos can be saved from some of these Hamann and Wittgenstein critiques of the possibilities of language in these things. So
wonderful. Well, let's close up with, where do people find you, and how do they follow your show, or whatever you're working on these days? Where are you at?
Oh man, I did have a podcast that was going strong. I'll still probably throw some stuff up there every now and then. The Caffeine Stream, which you can find on YouTube and Spotify. But most of my work recently has been with Jack Donovan over on Pater magazine. That's ph2t3r.com, I believe. The book I mentioned before should be coming out in March, which should be around the time this drops, maybe a little bit later. And we have live streams going on every Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific time.
On what platform?
On YouTube.
Okay.
And that's on the Order of Fire YouTube channel.
Okay. Sounds good.
So.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm thankful that you came on the show and we got to have a long, perhaps difficult and grounded conversation. But at the end of it, it's better. Like, it's a good. I'm glad I was able to do it, and if nothing else, it was important for me. So maybe I'll be selfish about it, but I appreciated it.
It was fun. I'm sure a couple people will sit through the full thing.
You'll be surprised. There's quite a few, and it's kind of an interesting problem. But I can't open that can of worms, otherwise we'll be on here for another hour. So I literally have to close. So
I've gotten 3 stink eyes from the wife. So,
all right. We will see you later. Take care. For those who are still listening, go forth and conquer, and we will catch you soon. Bye.